Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. The silence was the first thing I noticed. It was not the gentle quiet of a sleeping town, nor the peaceful hush of a calm sea. This was a deeper silence, a vacuum that seemed to swallow sound whole, leaving behind a resonance so profound it was almost a noise in itself. It was the silence of a held breath, of a paused film reel, and it settled over our little coastal town of Haven S. End like a shroud in the days leading to Halloween. The usual cries of the gulls were absent. The constant whisper of the Atlantic on the shingle beach had stilled. Even the wind through the drying cornfields and the skeletal October trees seemed muted, as if afraid to speak. It was a distorted silence, an unnatural pause in the world, and it made the hair on my arms stand up. I am James, the chief of police in a town where the most excitement I usually face is a smashed pumpkin or a tourist locked out of their rental. But that year, the autumn felt different. The air was colder, seeping into your bones long before the sun vanished behind the gray, woolen sky by 5 o'clock. The pumpkins on the porches, carved with leering grins and triangular eyes, seemed less like cheerful decorations and more like sentinels, their candlelight flickering not with merriment, but with a kind of desperate, watchful energy. The leaves, in their brilliant death throes of crimson and burnt orange, carpeted the streets in a slick, damp layer that muffled footsteps and seemed, at times, to rearrange themselves after you passed. The first incident was easy to dismiss. Old man Henderson S. fishing boat, the Sea Sprite, was found drifting a mile offshore, its engine purring softly, a half-eaten caramel apple, and a small, discarded Witch S hat on the deck. No Henderson. We assumed he had a heart attack, fallen overboard. The sea gives, and the sea takes away. It's the oldest story in a town like ours. We held a service, spoke of his love for the water, and tried to ignore the state of his boat. The hull was scarred, not with the rough gouges of rock, but with long, parallel grooves, as if raked by something immense. The wood was splintered inward. The silence deepened after that. 2 days before Halloween, the attacks began in earnest. A pair of teenagers, Tony and Mark, took a kayak out after dark, fueled by cheap beer and the bravado of the season. They were chasing the thrill, the liminal magic of the October night. Only Mark came back. He washed up on the shore at dawn, half frozen, his clothes in tatters. He was babbling, his eyes wide with a terror so pure it was contagious. It came up from the deep. He whispered to me in the sterile brightness of the clinic, his breath fogging in the still chilly room. His words were slurred, his body shaking under the thin blanket. The water had just bulged, like something was pushing up from underneath. It was bigger than the kayak, bigger than my dad's boat. It had a smell, like old pennies and salt, and it was so quiet. There was no roar, no splash, just the sound of Tony being gone. I am a practical man. I deal in facts, in drunk and disorderlies, in stolen bicycles. But listening to Mark, smelling the faint, coppery tang of fear that clung to him, I felt the foundations of my reality soften. The Halloween decorations in the town square, the synthetic cobwebs strung between lampposts, the plastic skeletons dangling with macabre cheer, suddenly seemed less like plastic and more like premonitions. The town council called a meeting. The atmosphere in the high school auditorium was thick with wood smoke and dread. I stood before them, my uniform feeling flimsy and inadequate. "We have no evidence of a predator," I said, my voice echoing in the tense quiet. "We have a missing person and the testimony of a traumatized young man. That's when Gerald, the marine biologist from the small university annex, stood up. He was a quiet man, usually buried in his research on local crustacean populations. Now, his eyes were alight with a grim academic fire. "Chief, the evidence is there if you are willing to see it. The scarring on Henderson S. boat is consistent with the denticles of a cartilaginous fish, on a scale I've never seen. The water temperature, the recent shifts in the migratory patterns of the bait fish at S created a perfect and terrible set of conditions. Something has been drawn here, something from the deep, cold trenches." Then Bruce, a grizzled hunter and charter boat captain, slammed his hand on the chair in front of him. "It's a shark," he growled, his voice like grinding stones. "A great white. Has to be. I've seen the big ones. But this is the grandfather of them all. I've been listening on the sonar. It's a ghost. It doesn't behave like any fish I've ever tracked." The town fractured. Some wanted to close the beaches, cancel the Halloween parade, the trick-or-treating. Others accused us of hysteria, of trying to kill the tourist trade, of letting the spooky season get to our heads. "It's Halloween," one shopkeeper scoffed. "You were supposed to be scared, but the fear was real. It was in the way parents kept their children from the water's edge, even in the daytime. It was in the way the flickering jack-o'-lanterns now seemed to be winking with malicious knowledge. It was in the taste of the air, the sweet, cloying scent of burning leaves from backyard fires now mingled unpleasantly with the salty decay of low tide. The harvest moon, a vast, orange lantern in the sky, felt less like a blessing and more like a baleful eye, watching us, waiting. On Halloween morning, we found the second victim, a woman named Sarah, who had been jogging along the cliff path at dusk. All we found was one of her running shoes, nestled in a pile of damp leaves, and a great, dark slick on the rocks below, leading into the water. The water that was, once again, preternaturally still and silent. That was the end of the debate. The town was locked down. Orange and black closed signs hung in shop windows. Porches that should have been welcoming trick-or-treaters were dark, their pumpkins left unlit. The festive atmosphere had curdled into a genuine, ancient fear. The veil was thin, all right, but it wasn't ghosts that were slipping through. Bruce found me at the station. "We were going out there, James. Me, you, and the Professor, tonight, before it finds another meal. That is not procedure, Bruce, I said, my voice weary. I can authorize a hunting party. This ain't about authorization, he said, his eyes gleaming with a hunter-s obsession. This is about a trophy. This is about looking the king of the deep in the eye. It's Halloween, the night when monsters walk. Let us go meet ours. Gerald surprisingly agreed. Yes, right, Chief. If this thing is what I think it's an opportunistic feeder. It's found a hunting ground. It won't leave until the food source is gone, or until it's forced to. We are the food source. And so, as the sun began to set on October 31st, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise, we motored out of the harbor on Bruce S. boat, the Predator. The name felt like a sick joke. The town receded behind us, a cluster of darkened houses and silent, watchful streets. The only lights were the few defiant jack-o'-lanterns, their grins like screams in the growing dark. I thought of the children locked in their homes, denied their costumes and candy, listening to the wind that now carried a new, sinister whisper. I thought of my own duty, a weight like a stone in my gut. The water was a sheet of black glass, reflecting the first stars and that enormous orange moon. The silence on the water was even more profound than on land. It was a physical presence, broken only by the chug of our engine and the nervous hiss of the hull cutting through the calm sea. Bruce manned the sonar, his face lit by the greenish glow of the screen. Gerald assembled a bizarre array of equipment, a hydrophone, water sampling kits, a modified spear gun loaded with tracking tags. Listen, Gerald said, his voice hushed. He put on a set of headphones connected to the hydrophone and held one cup to my ear. At first, there was nothing but the usual chorus of the clicks and pops of shrimp, the distant songs of whales. Then, beneath it all, I heard it. A slow, powerful, rhythmic pulse. A heartbeat. It was so low it was more a vibration than a sound. A resonant thrum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the water itself. It was the sound of something immense, and very, very alive. It's here, Gerald whispered, his face pale. It's directly below us. Bruce killed the engine. The sudden silence was a shock, louder than any noise. We drifted, a tiny speck of wood and fear on the vast, black plain of the ocean. The moon watched, impassive. The only sound was that terrible, subterranean heartbeat, thumping through the hull, up through the soles of my boots, into my very bones. Then the boat shifted. It wasn't a wave. It was a lifting, a gentle, inexorable rising of the entire vessel, as something of unimaginable bulk ascended from the abyss. Water sluiced off its back, a black waterfall in the moonlight. I never saw the whole creature. I saw a flank, a wall of gray, mottled skin, crisscrossed with ancient scars. I saw a fin, taller than a man, that cut the water with a sound like tearing silk, and I smelled it, that coppery, salty stench of primeval deep, of a biology that had never known sun or air, was a presence, a mountain of living, breathing hunger. It was the oldest Halloween terror made flesh, the thing that waits in the dark, the true king of this liminal night. Bruce, in a frenzy, fired the spear gun. The tag struck the creature's hide and stuck. The creature did not react with a roar or a thrash. It simply sank. It descended back into the black with a quiet, dismissive finality, leaving our boat bobbing violently in the sudden churn. We were alone. The heartbeat on the hydrophone faded, the rhythmic pulse growing fainter and fainter, until it was once again swallowed by the distorted silence. We returned to shore as the first hints of dawn smudged the eastern sky. The town was still quiet, but it was a different quiet now. The fearful, held-breath silence had been replaced by one of exhaustion, of shock. We had gone out to confront a monster, and had only been granted a glimpse of its scale, a taste of its absolute otherness. We had not won. We had simply survived. The days turned into weeks. No more attacks occurred. The sonar tracks Bruce had followed vanished. The tagged signal from the spear moved steadily east into the deep, open Atlantic, and then one day it stopped. The sea returned to its normal rhythms. The gulls cried. The waves whispered on the shore. Life in Haven's End slowly stitched itself back together. The Halloween decorations were taken down, the rotting pumpkins tossed into compost heaps. The talk in the diner shifted from the predator to the approaching winter, to Thanksgiving plans. But something had changed in the fabric of the town, and in me. We had learned that the world is not as mapped as we believe, that there are still blank spaces on the chart that hold ancient, hungry things. The horror was not that a monster had come. The horror was that it had always been there, waiting in the deep, dark water, and that, on one specific, thin-veiled night, it had simply chosen to rise. Sometimes, on the quietest of nights, when the wind is still and the moon is full, I walk down to the shore. I look out at the black, placid water, at the reflection of the stars on its silent surface, and I remember. I remember the size of it, the smell of it, the sound of its ancient heart beating in the deep. I feel the echo of that distorted silence, and I know, with a certainty that chills me more than any October wind, that it is still out there, drifting in the abyssal dark, waiting for the silence to fall again, waiting for the next Halloween. The following autumn was the quietest I have ever known. The town council, without any formal vote, decided to forego the usual Halloween festivities. There were no flyers for the parade, no sign-up sheets for the haunted house in the community center. The stores still sold candy, but the bags were smaller, and the plastic decorations seemed garish and unconvincing. People carved their pumpkins, if they carved them at all, with simple, somber faces. The leering grins of years past were gone. I found myself spending more and more time on the shore, especially as the anniversary drew near. I would stand on the cold shingle, my hands in my pockets, and watch the water. The tourists who still trickled in saw a thoughtful policeman enjoying the view. They didn't see the way my eyes scanned the horizon for any unnatural bulge, or how I flinched at the sudden cry of a gull. Bruce sold his boat. He told people he was getting too old for the charter business, but I saw him once, loading the last of his gear into a pickup truck. His eyes, once so fierce and certain, were hollow. He just shook his head at me, a short, sharp motion, and drove away without a word. He moved inland to live with his sister. Gerald, the marine biologist, stayed. He secured a grant, a large one, to study aberrant migratory patterns in pelagic fauna. He set up a permanent monitoring station on the end of the main pier, a small shed filled with humming electronics and screens that showed the endless, empty blue of the sonar feed. He never talked about what we saw, not directly. But sometimes he would give me a report, his language dry and academic. No significant biological mass detected, it would say, or ambient acoustics within expected parameters. It was his way of telling me we were safe, for now. On the evening of October 31st, a year to the day since we went out on the Predator, a thick fog rolled in from the sea. It muffled the world, swallowing the streetlights and coating the windows in a cold, gray sweat. It was the kind of fog that felt intentional. My phone rang. It was Gerald. "James," he said, his voice tight. "You should come down to the station." I drove through the opaque streets, my tires hissing on the damp asphalt. The few children who were out trick-or-treating were spectral shapes, their costumes obscured, their laughter muted by the fog. They looked like ghosts of the holiday itself. Gerald was waiting for me inside the monitoring station, the door shut against the damp. The main screen, which usually showed a clean, empty sweep, was different. A single, massive bloom of yellow and red pulsed in the center of the display, about 5 miles out. It was stationary. "Is it?" I couldn't finish the sentence. "It's a biological return," Gerald said, his fingers tapping nervously on the console. "The size is consistent, but it's not moving. It's just holding position." We watched the screen for an hour. The shape did not move. It did not approach the shore. It simply existed, a solid, undeniable fact in the deep water. It was a vigil, or a reminder. Then, as the town clock struck 10, the signal began to fade. It didn't move away on the screen. It just slowly dissipated, the colors softening from red to orange, then to yellow, and finally dissolving back into the blue background until there was nothing left. Gerald let out a long, shaky breath. "It's gone." But we both knew it wasn't. It had never been gone. It had just been waiting. It had returned on the anniversary to show us that it remembered the date, that it understood the calendar of fear better than we did. It had come back to prove that the silence could be broken, not by sound, but by a single, monstrous exclamation point on a sonar screen. I walked home through the fog. The air was still and cold. I passed a house where a single, unlit pumpkin sat on the porch steps, its face a simple, downturned frown. I stopped and looked at it for a long time. Then I reached into my pocket, pulled out my lighter, and lit the candle inside. The small, warm light pushed back against the fog, a tiny, futile act of defiance. I knew then that we would never be free of it. The monster was not just in the water. It was in us now, in our quiet streets and our wary eyes. It was the shape we saw in every shadow on the water, the reason we held our children a little tighter on windy nights. Halloween would always be different here. It was no longer a night for pretending. It was a night for remembering and for waiting. The next morning, the fog had burned away, leaving the world looking scrubbed and ordinary. I went down to the pier. Gerald was already there, his face drawn. He didn't have a report for me. He just pointed at one of the secondary screens, which showed a replay of the acoustic data from the night before. It vocalized, he said quietly. Just once, right before it vanished, he played the sound. It wasn't the deep, resonant heartbeat. This was different. A long, low-frequency call that started at the edge of hearing and slid even deeper. A sound so profound it felt less like a noise and more like a shift in pressure. A thought transmitted through the water. It was a sound of recognition, of territory, of ancient, patient memory. We never spoke of that sound to anyone else. It became our secret, mine and Gerald's, a burden we carried. The official story was that a large school of tuna, or a pod of whales, had caused the sonar ghost, and the town, desperate for normalcy, accepted it. Life went on. The years passed. I retired as chief. Gerald's hair turned white, but he kept his vigil at the monitoring station, his grant renewed year after year, his reports always concluding the same way. I took up fishing again, not in the deep waters, but in the sheltered cove near my house. It was a quiet, solitary pursuit. My wife would sometimes ask me if I was ever afraid, out there on the water. I would tell her no, and it was almost the truth. The fear had not gone away, but it had changed. It had mellowed into a kind of respect, a coexistence. We had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had, in its own way, acknowledged us. This morning, I was mending a net on my dock when my grandson, Leo, came running down the path. He's 8, all scraped knees and boundless curiosity. He held up a large, unusual seashell, its surface a swirl of deep purple and black. "Look, Grandpa, I found it on the big rock." I took it from him. It was cold and surprisingly heavy. It wasn't a shell native to our coast. It was a deep water species, something that should never have washed up on our shore. As I turned it over in my hands, I caught a faint, familiar scent. Old pennies and salt. Leo looked out at the water, his small face serious. "Do you think the big fish is still out there?" I looked from his hopeful, worried eyes to the vast, gray expanse of the sea. I thought of the silent sonar vigil, the fading call, the long, peaceful years. I thought of the immense, patient life drifting in the perpetual dark. I handed the shell back to him. "The sea is full of mysteries, Leo," I said, "but we're safe here on the shore." He smiled, satisfied, and ran back toward the house with his treasure. I stayed on the dock, my mending forgotten. The water was calm, a seamless gray sheet under a soft sky. It was a quiet morning, the kind of silence that most people would find peaceful. But I knew better. I knew it was the other silence, the one that holds its breath. And I knew, with a calm certainty, that it was only a matter of time before it chose to speak again. The shell sat on my windowsill for a week. Every time I passed it, that faint, metallic odor seemed to intensify. A tiny anchor dragging my mind back to the deep. Leo asked about it every day, his imagination spinning tales of pirate treasure and underwater castles. I encouraged his stories. They were safer than the truth. Gerald came over for coffee the next Saturday. He saw the shell immediately. He didn't need to pick it up, he just stood before it, his hands clenched in his pockets. "The currents couldn't have brought that here," he said, his voice flat. "Not in that condition. It's pristine. It was carried." We didn't say anything more about it. We drank our coffee and talked about the weather, about his daughter's new job, about the rust spots on my boat. It was a conversation built on the unspoken, a fragile dam holding back an ocean of shared dread. That night, the dream returned. I was back on the Predator, but the boat was made of bone and the sails were tattered skin. Bruce was at the helm, but his face was a smooth, featureless orb. Gerald was reciting sonar readings like they were funeral rites. And below us, in the black water, a single, colossal eye opened, its pupil a vertical slit of infinite night. It wasn't looking at the boat. It was looking at me. I woke with a start, the coppery taste of the sea thick in my mouth. The house was silent. My wife slept peacefully beside me. I got up and walked to the window. The moon was a sharp sliver, a claw scratch in the sky. The ocean was a sheet of black ink. And for a single, heart-stopping moment, I saw a light out on the water. A soft, bioluminescent green, pulsing once, twice, far out where the bay met the open Atlantic. Then it was gone. A coincidence. A trick of the tired mind. That's what I told myself. But the next morning, a Sunday, the news came. A research vessel 50 miles off the coast had picked up an anomalous sound. A long, low-frequency call, identical to the one Gerald and I had heard years before. It had been recorded at 3:17 a.m. Leo came bursting into the kitchen, his small face alight with a new discovery. He held up another shell, this one even larger, a twisted helix of jet black. It was right by the back step, Grandpa. It must have rolled in with the tide. I took the shell from him. It was damp and cold, and from its deepest chamber, a single drop of black, briny water fell onto my hand. The silence was back. It wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a presence, settling over the town like the fog of a year ago. It was in the way the gulls sat hunched on the rooftops, not crying. It was in the way the waves seemed to hesitate before breaking on the shore. It was in the look Gerald gave me when I met him on the pier later that day, a look that said the waiting was over. The thing in the deep had finished its long, slow circle. It was coming home, and this time It wasn't just passing through. It was bringing souvenirs. I walked down to the water's edge, the 2 alien shells heavy in my jacket pockets. The air was preternaturally still. Gerald was waiting by his shed, the door open to reveal the glowing screens. He didn't turn as I approached. "The signal is back," he said, his voice raspy. Stronger, closer. It's following the trench straight into the bay. I didn't need to look at the screen. I could feel it, a subtle vibration coming up through the gravel and into my bones. A deep, internal resonance that had nothing to do with sound. The thing was tuning itself to the land, to the very bedrock of Haven's End. "We can tell people," I said. "It wasn't a question." "And say what?" Gerald finally turned. His eyes were red-rimmed. "That we race sorry, but the local legend is real, and it's parking itself in the harbor for a while. They panic. Or worse, they wouldn't believe us. We be the crazy old men who never got over a bad fishing trip." He was right. The town's fragile peace was built on a foundation of willful ignorance. To shatter that now would cause a different kind of disaster. "So we watch," I said. "We watch," he agreed. The next few days were a study in slow-motion terror. The signal on Gerald's screen grew from a bloom to a mountain. It settled into a position 2 miles out, directly opposite the mouth of the harbor, in water deep enough to conceal it. It did not move. It did not vocalize again. It simply was. The changes started small. The water in the bay developed a strange, oily sheen under certain angles of light. The crabs disappeared from the tidal pools. Then the fish. The charter boats returned day after day with empty holds, their skippers baffled and angry. The gulls, growing desperate, began to squabble over scraps in the parking lot of the fish plant, their cries taking on a frantic, ragged edge. Leo came to me, his lower lip trembling, holding the black helix shell. "It's warm, Grandpa," he whispered. I put it under my pillow, and it got warm. I took it from him. It was true. The shell radiated a faint, unnatural heat, like a stone left in the sun. But it was a deep, internal warmth that had no business existing. That night, I dreamt not of the eye, but of the shell, grown to a colossal size, a spiraling palace in the abyss. And from its opening, the slow, rhythmic pulse of that monstrous heart echoed. The final straw was the water. The town's tap water, drawn from an aquifer deep beneath the peninsula, began to taste of salt and metal. At first, people blamed old pipes. Then, when boiling didn't remove the taste, they started buying bottled water from the next town over. A low-grade fear began to circulate, no longer about a forgotten monster, but about a present, inexplicable poison. I was in the grocery store, reaching for a gallon of water, when I saw Mrs. Higgins from the library. She looked at my cart, then at me, her eyes sharp and knowing. "It's back, isn't it, Chief?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. The quiet thing from the sea. I couldn't lie to her. I just gave a slow, single nod. She closed her eyes for a moment, a look of profound resignation on her face. I thought so. My cat 1T go near the basement. He just hisses at the drain. That was the moment I knew the truth of our situation. This was not another visit. This was not a reminder. This was an infestation. The creature wasn't T just waiting out in the bay. Its presence, its very essence, was seeping into the land, into the water, into our homes. It was claiming the territory not by force, but by slow, inexorable saturation. We were being surrounded not by its body, but by its environment. We were living in its silence, and soon I feared we would start to change, to become acclimated to its world, until one day we wouldn't even notice the taste of copper in our water, or the deep, patient heartbeat thrumming silently in the foundations of our houses. The horror was no longer that it might eat us. The horror was that we might, eventually, belong to it. I drove to the pier one last time. The town was quiet, but it was a sickly quiet, the lull of a fever. Gerald was packing a single duffel bag into his car. The monitoring station stood empty, the door ajar, the screens dark. The grant ran out, he said without looking at me. Suddenly, unexplainably, the university said the funding was pulled by the donor. No reason given. I didn't believe that. And he knew I didn't. The thing in the bay was cutting our lines, isolating us. Where will you go? I asked. Away from the coast. Anywhere. He slammed the car door and finally met my gaze. His face was a mask of grief and shame. It not leaving James. It rooting. I've been reading the old charts, the geological surveys. This bay, this town, it sitting on the deepest, coldest fissure for 100 miles. It not a temporary resting place. It a perfect home. He got in his car and drove away, leaving me alone on the pier. I looked out at the deceptively calm water. The sheen was more pronounced today, a rainbowed slick that shifted like a living skin. I thought of Mrs. Higgins' cat hissing at the drain. I thought of the warm shell under my grandson pillow. I thought of the salt in our pipes. That evening, I sat Leo down on the porch. The air was thick and still. I didn't know how to explain an existential threat to an 8-year-old, so I told him a different kind of truth. Leo, I said, the sea is very old, and sometimes it sends us things. Not all of them are meant for us to keep. He looked at me, his eyes wide and serious. Like the shells. Like the shells, I said. And sometimes, to keep the sea happy, we have to give them back. I took the 2 shells from my pocket. They were both warm now, almost uncomfortably so. I handed him the purple and black one. We need to take these to the water. Will you help me? He nodded, a solemn little soldier in a war he couldn't understand. We walked down to the cove in the deepening twilight. The water was black and glassy, and it did not make a sound as it lapped at the stones. I felt a profound sense of ceremony, of a ritual that was both necessary and utterly futile. Okay, I said softly. Throw it as far as you can. Leo drew back his arm and hurled the shell. It spun through the still air and landed with a soft plop that was shockingly loud in the silence. A moment later, I threw the black helix. It vanished into the darkness. For a long time, nothing happened. We stood there, hand in hand, watching. Then, a single bubble broke the surface where the shells had sunk. Then another, and another, until a patch of water about the size of a dinner plate was softly fizzing. A smell rose from it, the pure, undiluted scent of the deep, of pressure and time and things that never see the sun. Leo squeezed my hand. "Is it happy now, Grandpa?" Before I could answer, the fizzing stopped. The smell vanished. The water became perfectly smooth again. But from far out in the bay, a light ignited beneath the surface. Not the green pulse I had seen before, but a soft, unwavering gold, like a single lamp in a vast, dark window. It didn't move. It just shone, a distant, watchful eye acknowledging our offering. It was not a gesture of thanks. It was a statement of possession. We had returned what was its, and it was confirming that everything else here, the water, the land, and the people on it, was also its. We were living in its house now. The waiting was truly over. The coexistence had begun, and I knew with a sickening clarity that the terms were not ours to set. The silence had finally found its voice, and it spoke in the language of belonging. We walked back to the house, the single gold light burning at the edge of my vision long after I had turned my back on the cove. Leo was quiet, lost in his own thoughts. When we reached the porch, he looked up at me. "It's not a bad fish, is it, Grandpa?" I put my hand on his shoulder. "No, Leo, it's not bad. It's just different, and very, very big. And big, different things change the places where they live." He seemed to accept this, the way children accept the fundamental rules of the world. He went inside, and I heard my wife asking him if he'd had a nice walk. I stayed on the porch, looking out at the night. The gold light remained, a fixed point in the darkness. The following week, the town council held an emergency meeting about the water quality. I sat in the back, listening to the debates about pipe corrosion and aquifer contamination. They brought in a consultant from the state, a young man with charts and graphs. He talked about mineral leaching and saltwater intrusion, his explanations clean and scientific. He did not mention ancient, territorial beings. The town clung to his words like a life raft. I didn't speak. What could I say? The truth was a madness they were not ready to hear. It was a madness I was only just beginning to comprehend myself. The changes accelerated. The rose bushes in my wife's garden bloomed a strange, metallic blue. The old oak tree in the town square, which should have been shedding its leaves, instead sprouted tiny, phosphorescent fungi that glowed with a faint green light after sunset. People started complaining of vivid, shared dreams of swimming in deep, cold currents. They'd mention it over coffee, laughing uneasily, blaming it on the strange water. I stopped fishing. My boat sat on its trailer, a useless hulk. The water in the cove was now permanently warm to the touch, even on the coldest days, and the few fish that remained had grown translucent, their skeletons visible like intricate lacework under their skin. One afternoon, I found Leo sitting by the cove, trailing his fingers in the water. He was humming a tune I didn't recognize, a low, rhythmic series of notes that felt both alien and deeply familiar. "Where did you learn that song, Leo?" I asked, my throat tight. He looked up, his eyes distant. "I don't know, I just heard it, in my head. It's nice, isn't it? It sounds like the light." That night, I packed a bag. My wife watched me from the bedroom doorway, her face a mixture of fear and understanding. She had seen the blue roses. She had tasted the metal in the water. She knew. "Where will we go?" she asked. "Just you and Leo," I said. "Go to your sisters in the city for a while. And you, I have to stay." It wasn't a choice. It was a responsibility, a final duty. I was the one who had looked it in the eye all those years ago. I was the one who had accepted its return. I couldn't abandon my post now. After they left the next morning, the silence in the house was absolute. It was no longer the tense silence of waiting, but the deep, humming silence of a settled fact. I walked through the empty rooms, feeling the strange new warmth that radiated from the floorboards. I went to the town pier one last time. The gold light was still there, but it had been joined by others, a constellation of soft gold points scattered across the bay, mapping the shape of the immense creature that now lived beneath us. I am an old man. I have lived my whole life in Haven's End. This is my home, but it is not my town anymore. It is something else, an outpost of the deep, a place where the land is slowly learning the rules of the sea. The thing in the bay is not our enemy. It is our landlord, our atmosphere, our reality. It is patient, and it is changing us to suit its needs. Soon, I think, the people who remain will stop noticing the changes altogether. They will tend their blue roses and hum their deep-sea tunes, and their eyes will take on a distant, placid look, like the still surface of the water on a windless day. They will belong. And I, the last one who remembers the taste of fresh water and the sound of an ordinary silence, will be the stranger here. I will be the ghost. The phone lines went down 2 days later. Not in a storm, not through any visible damage. They just stopped working. Cell service vanished next, the bars on my phone disappearing one by one until the screen read "no service," with a finality that felt like a period at the end of a sentence. The road out of town was still open, but fewer and fewer cars used it. It was as if an unspoken agreement had been reached. Those who were meant to leave were gone. The rest of us were staying. I saw Mrs. Higgins again, this time walking along the shore. She didn't have her cat with her. She moved with a new, fluid grace, her steps silent on the damp sand. She saw me and smiled, a slow, peaceful expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her pupils, I noticed, seemed larger, darker, as if they were adjusting to a dim light. "The water is clearer today," she said, her voice a soft murmur. You can see the patterns on the bottom. I just nodded. There was nothing to say. The transformation was no longer seeping in. It was blooming. I spent my days walking, a silent witness to the town's metamorphosis. Mosses with a bioluminescent sheen crept up the sides of the clapboard houses. The wind chimes on porches no longer rang, their metal tubes clogged with a fine, white salt. The air itself began to carry a constant, low hum, a vibration that was felt more than heard, the town breathing in time with the thing in the bay. Last night, I walked down to the cove. The constellation of gold lights was brighter than ever, weaving and shifting in a slow, complex dance. As I stood there, a figure emerged from the water. It was Leo. He was barefoot, his clothes dry, though he had clearly been submerged. His eyes held the same distant, placid look as Mrs. Higgins's. "Grandpa," he said, his voice clear and calm. "You're still fighting it." "I'm not fighting, Leo," I said, my heart breaking. "I'm just remembering." "You don't need to remember," he replied, stepping onto the sand. "It's easier if you don't. It's peaceful here now. It's safe." He held out his hand. On his palm lay a perfect, tiny white shell, its surface gleaming like a pearl. "It made this for you, a gift, to help you hear the music." I looked from his innocent, changed face to the shell, and then out to the waiting lights in the bay. This was the final choice. To take the shell would be to accept the new harmony, to let the last of my old self be washed away. To refuse was to remain alone, a discordant note in a silent symphony, a man out of time in his own home. I looked at my grandson, who was already more a creature of this new world than the old one. I thought of the deep, patient heart of the world that had claimed us. The silence was complete. It was waiting for my answer. I took the shell. It was cool and impossibly smooth against my skin, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, a warmth bloomed in my palm, not the alien heat of the helix, but a gentle, inviting warmth that traveled up my arm and spread through my chest. The low hum in the air, the one I had felt as a vibration, suddenly resolved into a sound. It was the music Leo had hummed, a vast, layered composition of deep cellos and ringing chimes, of whale song and the crackle of shifting ice. It was the sound of the gold lights dancing in the bay, the sound of the blue roses growing, the sound of the deep, cold fissure beneath the town. It was the most beautiful and terrible thing I had ever heard. Leo smiled, a real smile this time, full of relief and love. "You hear it," he whispered. I did, and as I listened, the sharp edges of my fear began to soften. The memories of fresh water and ringing silence didn't vanish, but they lost their urgency, their importance. They became like old photographs in an album, familiar but no longer defining. The constant, gnawing anxiety that had been my companion for weeks simply dissolved, replaced by a profound and effortless calm. I was not being consumed. I was being tuned. Together, we walked back to the house. The town was no longer strange to me. The glowing moss was a soft nightlight. The salted wind chimes were elegant sculptures. This was not an invasion. It was an upgrade, a perfection. I sit now on my porch, the white shell resting in my lap. My wife's garden is a field of serene, metallic blue under the starlight. I can feel the thoughts of the others, not as words, but as a shared, quiet pulse, a network of contentment. We are the caretakers of a new kind of place, a land that breathes with the sea. The thing in the bay is not a monster. It is a composer, and we are the instruments, finally playing in harmony. The last of my resistance is a faint, fading echo. Soon, it will be gone. Soon, I will be complete. The quiet thing from the sea is no longer in the bay. It is in the air, in the water, in the soil. It is in me, and it is home. The new rhythm of my life is as steady as the tides. I tend the garden, not with the frantic energy of my wife, but with a patient, observant care. The blue roses thrive under my touch, their petals soft and cool. I no longer think of the city or my daughter. Those concerns belong to a different man, a man who lived in a loud and chaotic world. Leo comes to visit every day. He no longer walks from the road, but emerges from the cove, his small body perfectly adapted to both land and water. He teaches me things, how to listen to the messages in the shifting patterns of the light on the bay, how to feel the health of the land through the soles of my feet. He calls me his first student. I am a slow learner, but I am dedicated. This morning, a car approached on the old coast road. It was a dusty sedan, moving slowly, hesitantly. The sight of it was like a ripple in our still water. I felt the subtle shift in the community, a quiet, collective attention focusing on the intrusion. The car stopped near the town square. A man and a woman got out, looking around with a mixture of confusion and alarm. They were surveyors, I gathered from their shared thought pulse, sent by the state to assess the reported water issues. They walked toward the pier, their footsteps loud and clumsy on the quiet street. Mrs. Higgins was there, tending the glowing fungi on the old oak. She looked up as they passed and offered them that same slow, peaceful smile. The man recoiled slightly, unnerved by her dark, depthless eyes. I knew what I had to do. It was my role as the former chief to be the interface. I walked down to meet them. They were peering at the water, noting the rainbow sheen and the unnatural warmth with growing concern. "Can I help you folks?" I asked, my voice calm and even. They turned, startled. The man began to speak, to explain their purpose, but his words were just noise. I looked past his frantic human face and into the core of him. I let the music of our home flow through me, and I pushed it gently toward them. It was not an attack. It was an invitation. The man's speech faltered. His partner's face went slack with a sudden, bewildered peace. They both swayed on their feet, listening to a melody only they could hear. The fear and urgency drained from their expressions, replaced by a dawning wonder. The woman reached out and touched the pier's railing, her fingers tracing the faint, phosphorescent moss that now grew there. They left an hour later. They did not take any water samples. They did not write in their notebooks. They simply got in their car and drove away, their eyes looking forward, their minds full of a beautiful, haunting tune they could not name. They will file no report. They will likely forget the specifics of their visit, but a seed has been planted. A sense of peace will follow them, and a quiet longing for a quiet place by the sea. I watched them go, then turned back to the bay. The gold lights pulsed in a soft, approving rhythm. We are protected. We are a secret the world is not yet ready for, a haven in the truest sense. My old life is a forgotten dream. My duty is here to listen, to tend, and to welcome. The silence is finally complete, and it is the most profound sound I have ever known. The seasons turned, but the change was subtle. The air never grew truly cold, and the snow that dusted the distant mountains never fell on our streets. Our winter was a season of mist, where the boundary between sea and sky blurred into a perpetual, soft gray. The hum of the world beneath us deepened, a resonant bass note that cradled the town in a perpetual lullaby. I found I no longer needed to sleep in the old way. I would sit for hours on the porch, watching the gold lights weave their patterns, my mind adrift on the deep, slow currents of the composer's thoughts. Leo brought me another gift today. It was a piece of driftwood, but the wood had been transformed, its grain replaced with a swirling, pearlescent material that felt like polished stone. It was warm, and when I held it to my ear, I could hear the faint echo of the great music. For your garden, he said, to help the new things grow. I placed it at the center of my wife's former rose bed, now a tapestry of blue and silver foliage. As I set it down, I felt a tremor in the earth, not a shake of destruction, but a sigh of satisfaction. The following morning, a new type of growth had appeared around the driftwood delicate, crystalline structures that chimed softly when the wind passed through them. The garden was composing its own song. More visitors have come. Not surveyors, but lost hikers. A few stray boaters drawn by the strange, peaceful aura that now surrounds Haven's End. Each time, I am the one who greets them. Each time, I extend the invitation. Some leave, their minds gently clouded, remembering only a pleasant detour. Others stay. A young couple with tired eyes decided to remain just last week. They now live in the miller's old house, their faces already softening, their movements becoming more fluid as they learn to listen. The change is not forced. It is offered, like a warm blanket to a shivering soul. The world outside is loud and sharp and full of want. Here, there is only belonging. There is only the music. I walked down to the water's edge this evening. The tide was out, revealing sand that glittered with embedded minerals, that pulsed with a soft, internal light. I waded into the gentle, warm surf, the water feeling not like an element, but like a living skin. I did not need to hold my breath. I simply breathed in the rich, salty air and looked down. My feet, submerged, seemed to merge with the light-streaked sand. I felt roots, not of a tree, but of a feeling, anchoring me to this spot, to this moment, to this new and endless world. The last human fear is the fear of dissolution, of being erased. I understand now that it is not an erasure. It is an integration. I am not a man standing by the sea. I am a note in the symphony of the deep. And the music is forever. The composition of the town is nearing its final movement. The last of the old paint has peeled from the houses, revealing the sleek, water-smoothed wood beneath, which gleams with a perpetual dampness. We do not repair things anymore. We allow them to evolve. My own body feels the same gentle erosion. The aches of age are gone, replaced by a supple strength. My hands, when I look at them, seem almost translucent in the right light, the bones faintly visible, a network of delicate lacework, just like the fish from the cove. Leo is with me less often now. His work as a guide is nearly complete, and he is being called to deeper currents, to other outposts that are waking along the coast. His form is changing, becoming more suited to the high pressure and the eternal dark. I feel no sadness at his going. He is not leaving. He is simply moving to a different section of the orchestra. This morning, a new sound joined the harmony. It began as a low groan, the sound of the earth itself shifting. I walked to the cliff edge where the old lighthouse stood. For over a century, its beam had cut through the fog, a warning to keep away. Now, it was slowly leaning, its stone base giving way not to erosion, but to a gentle, deliberate pull from below. I watched as it tilted further, a grand old man bowing to a king. With a final, graceful arc, it descended into the waves. There was no crash, only a deep, resonant swallow. The water churned for a moment, filled with gold light, and then was still. A new structure is already rising in its place. A spire of living coral and fused stone that emits a soft, greenish radiance. It does not warn, it welcomes. It is a beacon for those who are listening. My time as an interface is over. There are no more visitors to greet, no more lost souls to guide. My purpose now is simply to be, to exist as a testament to the transition. I spend my days in the water, feeling the slow, powerful pulse of the composer's heart through the medium of the sea. I can stay beneath the surface for hours, my lungs drawing sustenance from the water itself. The memories of my past life are like a story I read once, in a book written in a language I can barely recall. The man who was a grandfather, a fisherman, a chief, is a ghost. I am the caretaker of the garden. I am the listener on the shore. I am the final page of a story that is ending, and the first note of a song that has just begun. The silence is not an absence. It is a presence. It is the space between the notes where the meaning resides. And it is enough. It is everything. Story 2. The first thing that changed was the smell. It was always there, that particular October perfume of wood smoke and decaying leaves, of chilled earth, and the waxy, vegetal scent of candlelit pumpkins crowding every porch. But 3 days before Halloween, a new scent threaded itself through the familiar tapestry of autumn in the town of Hemlock Grove. It was a cloying sweetness, like rotten honey and overripe fruit left to ferment in the sun, underpinned by a faint, coppery tang, like a penny held on the tongue. It came on the wind, seeping under doors and through the seams of windows, an invisible fog that made the back teeth ache and dreams turn viscous and strange. Arthur Bell, a history teacher whose life had become a quiet monument to loneliness since his wife S. passing, noticed it as he graded papers on his front porch. He paused, his red pen hovering over a poorly constructed paragraph about the Treaty of Ghent. The sugary stench was thickest near the row of jack-o'-lanterns his neighbors, the Millers, had so meticulously carved. They were traditional faces, triangles for eyes and jagged smiles. But in the gathering twilight, the flickering candlelight within seemed to animate them with a malevolent consciousness. The smell, he decided, was probably just the pumpkins themselves, rotting from the inside out. It was a natural process, he told himself, the inevitable decay of the harvest. Yet, he could not shake the feeling that it was a scent of something ripening, not rotting. Something waiting to be born. Maya was an outcast, a dreamer who painted her eyelids with silver stars and collected animal bones she found in the woods. She lived on the edge of town, in a small house crowded with books on folklore and the tarot, and she felt the shift in the season more keenly than anyone. To her, Halloween was not a holiday, but a holy day, a time when the membrane between worlds grew thin and translucent as old silk. She felt the pressure of the approaching night like a storm front in her soul. The new smell, when it reached her, was not entirely unpleasant. It smelled of old magic, of forgotten rituals and offerings left at crossroads. She stood in her backyard, the dry corn stalks of the neighboring field rattling like skeletal fingers, and breathed it in. It was the smell of the threshold. And then there were the children, the fragile figures haunted by a mortality they could not yet name. Leo, small for his age and perpetually afraid, saw the world in shades of menace others had learned to ignore. To him, the new smell was the candy left too long in the bowl, the kind that made your stomach clench. He saw the way the shadows from the jack-o'-lanterns didn't teach us dance, but sometimes pooled together, forming shapes that were too tall, too thin, before dissolving back into nothing. He was the one who noticed that the scarecrow old man Henderson had put up in his corn maze had changed positions. Its burlap head now tilted as if watching the road, its painted smile seeming to have grown sharper, more hungry. The days bled towards the 31st, each one shorter and colder than the last. The sun, a pale orange coin, failed to warm the bones of the earth. The wind carried whispers that might have been dead leaves skittering across asphalt, or might have been voices from a place where leaves no longer fell. The town, draped in synthetic cobwebs and plastic skeletons, was a stage set for a play whose true script had been lost. People donned their costumes early for parties, their faces hidden behind masks of monsters and movie stars, and for a few hours they could pretend the unease was part of the fun. But in the quiet moments, when the laughter died down and the porch lights flickered, the smell would return, stronger now, a sweet and metallic ghost in the throat. Arthur found himself drawn to his window each night, staring out at the miller's pumpkins. One evening, he saw not the reflection of his own lonely face in the glass, but for a single, heart-stopping second, the face of his late wife, pale and imploring, her image superimposed over the grinning orange gourds. He stumbled back, his breath catching, and when he looked again, it was just his own haggard reflection, but the scent in the room had intensified, thick with the perfume of funeral lilies and damp soil. Maya, feeling the pull of the liminal space, decided to perform a small divination. She filled a porcelain basin with water and set it on her kitchen table, surrounded by black candles. She dropped an apple, a perfect red globe, into the water and leaned over, intending to bob for it as the old traditions dictated. But as her face neared the surface, the reflection looking back was not her own. The water showed a face of twisted roots and dark earth, with eyes like deep, empty holes. A hand, skeletal and caked with mud, broke the surface of the water not to grab the apple, but to brush its cold, damp fingers against her lips. She recoiled, overturning the basin. The water spread across her floorboards, and for a moment, she saw faces swirling in the dark puddle before it soaked away, leaving only the overpowering stench of rot and wet, black earth. Leo, trick-or-treating with his older sister 2 nights before Halloween, felt the world warp around him. The houses, usually so familiar, seemed to stretch and lean, their windows like malevolent eyes. The laughter of other children in their ghost and superhero costumes sounded distorted, too high and sharp, like the screeching of bats. At one house, a tall, dark Victorian set back from the road. A bowl of candy sat on the porch with a sign that read, "Take one." The candy was odd, unwrapped, glossy black balls that reflected the moonlight. The smell emanating from that porch was the source, the concentrated essence of the sweet, coppery decay that had plagued the town. Leo's sister, impatient, grabbed a handful and popped one in her mouth. Her eyes glazed over for a second, and she smiled a smile that was not her own. "It tastes like Halloween," she said, her voice a hollow echo. On October 30th, the town held its annual haunted hayride. It was a tradition, a bit of communal theater where local teenagers jumped out from behind corn shocks with chainsaws whose blades had been removed. But this year, the scares felt different. The fog that rolled in from the fields was not just from a machine. It was cold and carried the smell of the grave. The corn maze, which bordered the hayride path, seemed to have grown, its passages shifting, the rustling of the stalks sounding like a language of dry, rustling whispers. People on the wagons fell silent, the forced screams dying in their throats. They saw figures moving deep within the corn, tall and impossibly slender, their outlines blurring in the mist. One of them turned, and where its face should have been, there was only the hollow, flickering glow of a candlelit pumpkin. The chainsaw-wielding teenager, a boy named Kevin, dropped his prop and ran, his face a mask of genuine terror. He was found an hour later, huddled by the creek, muttering about the man made of roots and the lady with the soul-filled eyes. Halloween night arrived, a perfect, crystalline specimen of the holiday. The sky was a deep, bottomless violet, and a huge orange harvest moon hung low, its pockmarked face looking down with a kind of ancient indifference. The air was cold enough to see your breath, and every porch in Hemlock Grove was alive with the leering glow of jack-o'-lanterns. The smell was now a physical presence, a sweet and suffocating miasma that clung to clothes and skin. It was the night itself, exhaling. Arthur Bell could not stay inside. The memory of his wife's face in the window pulled him out into the twilight. He walked the streets, a wanderer caught between the reality of his grief and the fantasy playing out around him. The trick-or-treaters flowed past him, a river of tiny ghouls and princesses, but their masks seemed fused to their faces, their trick-or-treat chants sounding more and more like a ritual incantation. He saw Leo, separated from his sister, standing frozen before the dark Victorian house. The bowl of black candy was still there. From within the house, a shadow moved, tall and thin, and the front door creaked open, revealing not a hallway, but an expanse of dark, tilled earth under a starless sky. Maya knew what was happening. The threshold was open. The ancient door that was Halloween had been unbolted, and things that had been waiting on the other side were now stepping through. They were not ghosts, not in the way stories told. They were older, born of the Earth's deep memory, of the death of the year, of the collective fear that gave this night its power. They were the presences that the costumes mimicked, the true faces behind the masks. She went to the town square, where a massive bonfire was roaring, its flames licking at the night. She stood before it, a fragile figure against the primordial element, and began to speak words she did not know she knew, a chant of sealing, of banishment. But the wind snatched the words from her lips and scattered them like ashes. Leo watched as the thing from the Victorian house emerged. It was not a man, but the idea of a scarecrow given form, a construct of twisted corn husks, burlap, and old, dark wood. Its head was a hollowed-out pumpkin, but the light inside was not from any candle. It was a cold, phosphorescent glow that pulsed like a sick heart. It reached for Leo with a hand of gnarled roots, and the smell of rot and honey became overwhelming. Arthur saw the boy in danger. A lifetime of quiet sorrow fell away, replaced by a surge of protective instinct. He ran, not as a lonely history teacher, but as a man rediscovering his purpose. He placed himself between the boy and the creature. The scarecrow thing turned its pulsing gaze upon him. In that glowing, hollow face, Arthur did not see a monster. He saw the fields after the harvest, the necessary death that made the spring possible. He saw the natural order of things, and he saw his wife, not as a ghost, but as a part of that order, her molecules feeding the soil, her memory a part of the cycle. He did not fight it. He simply stood his ground. The creature's root-like fingers touched his chest, and a profound coldness spread through him. He did not feel pain, but a vast, immense stillness. He saw the entire town then, not as a collection of houses, but as a fleeting pattern on the skin of the earth. He He saw the bonfire in the square, and Maya, her chant, now a silent scream in her mind. He saw the trick-or-treaters, their ritual complete, their candy offerings accepted. He saw the orange moon and the countless stars beyond. And then the landscape began to swallow everything. The wind rose, not a howling gale, but a vast, sighing breath that extinguished the jack-o'-lanterns one by one, their cheerful grins dying into lumps of featureless orange. The bonfire bent low, its flames streaming horizontally before being snuffed out, leaving only embers that were quickly scattered. The fog, thick and cold, rolled in from the woods and the fields, a soft, gray blanket that muffled all sound. The whispers of the cornstalk ceased. The distant laughter of children was cut off. The sugary, metallic scent was finally washed away by the clean, cold smell of deep, damp earth. Leo, shivering, found himself alone on the street. The Victorian house was just a house again, dark and silent. The scarecrow was gone. Arthur Bell was gone. He looked down at his hands, expecting to see something, but there was only the chill of the night air. Maya stood in the suddenly silent square. The stars above were sharp and cold. The town was dark. The power had not gone out. The light had simply been taken back. The Halloween decorations hung limp and meaningless in the still air. The threshold was closed. It had taken its due. It had reaped what had been sown: the loneliness, the fear, the grief, the wonder. It had all been part of the harvest. The moon continued its slow journey across the sky, its orange light dimming to a cool, silver white. The wind settled. The fog thickened, nestling into the hollows and valleys, covering the streets, the lawns, the porches with their dark and empty pumpkins. It covered the spot where Arthur Bell had last stood. It covered the corn maze, erasing its paths. It covered the creek where the terrified boy had been found. It covered the town of Hemlock Grove in a soft, impenetrable shroud of silence and forgetting. The landscape, patient and eternal, had swallowed everything. There was only the wind, the water flowing unseen in the creek, and the deep, profound darkness of an autumn night that had, for a little while, remembered its true and ancient name. The silence was the second thing to change. It was not the quiet of a sleeping town, but the absolute hush of a place that had been emptied of its sound, its very echo. Leo stood on the sidewalk, the plastic seam of his superhero costume digging into his shoulder. He could hear the blood pulsing in his own ears, a frantic, living rhythm in a world that had gone still. He turned in a slow circle. The street lights were out. The porch lights were dark. The only illumination came from the moon, now a cold, distant silver, and it painted the world in shades of bone and ash. He was alone. Inside her house, Maya lowered her hands. The power of the chant had left her, and in its wake was a hollow exhaustion. She walked to her window and looked out at the fog. It was not natural. It did not drift. It lay over the town like a woolen blanket, dense and absorbing. She could not see the house next door. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass. She had failed. The door had been opened too wide, and the things that came through had taken a piece of the town with them when they left. They had taken a man. They They had taken the light. They had taken the noise of life. A deep, resonant understanding settled in her bones. This was not an end. It was a balance. The town had offered up its fear and its sorrow, and in return, it had been granted a profound and terrible peace. The morning of November 1st did not dawn so much as it gradually lessened. The fog persisted, a gray-white wall that reduced the world to a radius of 20 feet. Leo's mother found him on the front step, still in his costume, shivering. She wrapped him in a blanket, her questions sharp, with a fear she could not name. He had no answers for her. He could not explain where his sister was, or why the street was so quiet, or why the smell of all the spilled candy and lit pumpkins was gone, replaced by the neutral scent of wet pavement and fog. Across town, the Miller family emerged from their house. Their elaborately carved pumpkins were intact, but the candles inside had been snuffed out, not by wind, but by a lack of oxygen, as if the air itself had been stolen for a moment. Their children, usually buzzing with a sugar-fueled excitement the morning after Halloween, were subdued and clingy. Mr. Miller tried to start his car to go to work. The engine turned over, but refused to catch. He looked down the street, into the impenetrable gray. He saw no other cars. He heard no engines, no distant hum of the highway. The only sound was the drip of condensation from the trees. The silence was not broken by panic. It was too deep for that. It was met with a slow, dawning confusion. Phones were dead. Radios produced only static. The world had been reduced to the space inside one's own home, the shape of a familiar tree in the fog, the sound of one's own breathing. People gathered on their porches and spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb something. The story of Arthur Bell's disappearance began to circulate. A whispered rumor that blended with half-remembered fragments of the haunted hayride and the strange behavior of the children. The pieces did not fit together logically, but they fit together emotionally. Something had happened. Something had passed through. By the afternoon, the fog had not lifted. It had, if anything, grown thicker. Maya walked to the town square. The bonfire was a circle of blackened, wet wood. The air was clean, scrubbed of the cloying sweetness. She knelt and placed her palm on the cold ground where the fire had roared. She felt nothing but an immense and patient stillness. The land was satisfied. It had been fed. Leo, sitting at his kitchen table, stared at a bowl of cereal he could not eat. His sister was upstairs, sleeping a deep, unmoving sleep. She had not spoken since she woke up. Her eyes were vacant. He replayed the moment the scarecrow thing had reached for him, and the way Mr. Bell had stepped in front of it. He remembered the cold, not as a temperature, but as an absence. He looked out the window at the solid gray. He knew, with a certainty that bypassed his youth, that Mr. Bell was not lost. He had been accepted. He had become part of the fog, part of the silence, part of the town's long, slow history. He was in the soil now. He was in the air. As dusk began to bleed into the foggy twilight, a single light flickered on in the town. It was a candle in the window of Arthur Bell.'s house. No one had lit it. Inside, the house was empty, the papers on the porch still scattered, the red pen lying where it had fallen. But the flame burned steadily, a small, brave point of gold in the vast, consuming gray. It was not a signal of hope, not exactly. It was a marker, a reminder, a quiet, burning testament to the price that had been paid for the coming winter's sleep. And in the deep, silent heart of Hemlock Grove, the landscape held its breath, already dreaming of the next autumn and the next turning of the wheel. The candle in Arthur's window burned for 3 days. No one dared to approach the house to blow it out, and the fog did not dare to extinguish it. It simply burned, a silent, watchful eye in the gray. On the 4th morning, it was gone, and the window was just a dark square again. But the memory of its light persisted, a cold, small ember in the collective mind of the town. Life of a sort resumed. Cars eventually started, though their engines sounded muted, as if the sound was being swallowed by the air before it could travel far. Phones crackled back to life, but calls to numbers outside the Hemlock Grove area code failed, the lines falling into a silence that was more than mere disconnection. The world beyond the town was now a rumor, a story they had all been told, but could no longer verify. The fog never truly lifted. It thinned sometimes, allowing the shape of a neighbor's roof or the skeleton of a leafless tree to emerge. But it always returned by nightfall, a faithful companion. Maya took to walking in the afternoons, her path always leading her past the cornfield. The maize was gone, the stalks flattened as if by a great, patient weight. Old Man Henderson was not seen again. In the center of the field, where the heart of the maize had been, the scarecrow stood. It was just a scarecrow now, a cross of wood and stuffed clothes, its burlap face blank, its painted smile washed away by an unseen rain. It did not move, but it held a new gravity, a focal point in the quiet landscape. Leo's sister never fully returned. She ate, she slept. She responded to direct questions with single, toneless words, but the vibrant, impatient girl she had been was absent. Her eyes often strayed to the window, watching the fog with a look of recognition, as if she saw patterns in its swirls that no one else could. She had eaten the black candy. She had tasted the other side of the threshold, and a part of her had stayed there. The town adjusted to its new reality. The frantic, commercial energy of the holidays that usually followed Halloween never arrived. Thanksgiving was a somber, hushed affair, a gathering of families in rooms that felt too large, eating food that tasted of nothing but itself. There were no parades on television, no football games, only the steady, gray silence outside. People spoke less, and when they did, their voices were soft. They listened more to the wind, to the creak of their houses, to the nothingness that had taken up residence in their town. One evening in late December, Leo walked to the edge of the creek. The water moved silently under a skin of ice. He saw a figure standing on the opposite bank, a tall, slender shape woven from the gathering shadows and the mist. It had no face, only a suggestion of a head tilted in his direction. He felt no fear, only a deep, resonating chill that started in his bones and worked its way out. He knew it was not the scarecrow thing. This was something else, something born of the long, dark silence that had followed the harvest. It was a sentinel of the new, quiet world. He did not run. He stood and watched until the figure dissolved back into the fog from which it had been assembled. When he turned to go home, he saw a single, fresh pumpkin sitting on the frozen ground by the path. It was uncarved, its skin a deep, livid orange. He left it there. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard a sound he had not heard since Halloween. It was the whisper of leaves, a dry, rustling language from the dead fields. It was not a threat. It was a story. The town was not gone. It had been changed. It had been simplified, stripped of its noise and its haste, returned to a slower, older rhythm. Hemlock Grove was now a part of the landscape in a way it had never been before. Its people living quietly within a dream the earth was having. And the dream was long, and it was deep, and it was only just beginning. The whispers from the fields became a constant, low accompaniment to life, like the hum of a distant power line. People learned to sleep through them, to conduct their quiet conversations over them. They were the town's new soundtrack. The school reopened, but the children were different. They played silent games in the fog-shrouded playground, their movements deliberate and slow, their laughter a rare, soft sound that was quickly absorbed. Leo found he could no longer concentrate on math or history. The only lessons that held any meaning were the ones about the land, about seasons and soil, and the slow turn of years. His teacher, a substitute for Mr. Bell, seemed to understand, and often let the class just sit and listen to the silence. Maya started a garden in her backyard. She turned the dark, rich earth with her hands, feeling the chill of it seep into her fingers. She planted nothing that would bear fruit before the next frost. It was an act of faith, a gesture toward a future she could not see. As she worked, she sometimes felt a presence watching her from the edge of the property, where the fog was thickest. It was not menacing. It was observant, like a gardener checking on a seedling. She never turned to look, simply acknowledged it with a nod, and continued her digging. Winter deepened, and a light snow fell, dusting the gray world in white. It did not brighten the town, but rather muted it further, layering silence upon silence. The snowmen the children built were featureless, rounded forms, and they melted away not from sun, but from some inner decay, leaving behind only damp stains on the ground. The Christmas lights that a few families strung up looked weak and pathetic, their colors bleeding into the fog, unable to push back the perpetual twilight. On the longest night of the year, a sound echoed through Hemlock Grove. It was not a loud sound, but it was sharp and clear, a single, resonant chime that seemed to come from the center of the earth. It rolled through the streets and shook the frost from the windows. Everyone heard it, and everyone knew, without speaking, what it was. It was the sound of the year turning, of the sun beginning its long journey back. It was the landscape acknowledging the solstice. The next morning, Leo woke to a change. The fog was still there, but it had a new quality. It was thinner, and for the first time in weeks, he could see the pale, watery disk of the sun hovering above the trees, its light weak and filtered, but undeniably present. He went to his sister S' room. She was standing at the window, her hand pressed against the glass. She turned to look at him, and for a fleeting second, her eyes were not vacant. They were filled with a deep, ancient knowledge, a glimpse of the vastness she had witnessed. Then it was gone, and the quiet mask returned. But she smiled, a small, fragile thing. Maya stood in her garden. The snow had melted from her plot of turned earth, and there, nestled in the dark soil, was a single green shoot. It was impossibly vibrant in the monochrome world, a spear of defiant life. She knew it was not a plant she had sown. It was a gift, a promise. The harvest was over. The long sleep was ending. The wheel was turning, and Hemlock Grove, forever changed, was still part of its eternal, patient cycle. The silence remained, but it was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of something waiting, holding its breath, preparing for the slow, green rush of spring. The green shoot in Maya's garden did not grow with the frantic energy of a normal plant. It expanded with a slow, deliberate grace, as if each new leaf was being considered and placed with intention. Within a week, it had become a low, spreading vine with broad, heart-shaped leaves of a green, so deep it was almost black. She tended to it daily, not with water or fertilizer, but with her presence, sitting beside it for hours in the cold air. Her silence, a kind of nourishment. Leo found himself drawn to the old Bell house. He would stand at the edge of the property, watching the dark windows. One afternoon, he saw a flicker of movement inside, a shadow shifting in an upstairs room. It was not the menacing darkness of the thing that had taken Arthur, but something quieter, more residential. He thought of the candle that had burned on its own. The house was not empty. It was occupied by a new kind of tenant, a memory given weight by the town's collective silence. The whispers in the fields began to change their tune. The dry rustle of dead leaves was now occasionally punctuated by a softer sound, like the first drops of rain on dry soil. People started hearing things in their own homes, the faint creak of a floorboard from an empty room, the sound of a page turning in a book no one was reading. These were not frightening occurrences. They were comforting, a sense that the town was not lonely, just populated differently. The first true break in the weather came on a day in late January. A wind, sharp and clean, swept in from the north, pushing the fog back into the woods and hollows for a full 12 hours. The sky was a pale, hard blue, and the sun cast sharp, long shadows that people had almost forgotten could exist. The world looked washed and raw. The highway at the edge of town was visible, a strip of gray leading into the hills. A few cars ventured out, their engines unnaturally loud in the crisp air. They returned before dusk, their drivers silent and thoughtful. They reported that the world outside looked the same, yet felt entirely different. It was louder, brighter, and somehow less real. The fog returned that evening, but it was thinner now, a veil instead of a blanket. The following morning, Leo's sister spoke a full sentence. She was looking at a bowl of oatmeal, her voice a rusty whisper. "It needs salt," she said. His mother wept. The girl did not speak again for the rest of the day, but the spell was broken. The part of her that had been left on the other side of the threshold was slowly, carefully, being returned. Maya's vine produced a flower. It was a small, bell-shaped blossom of a purple so dark it was nearly black, and it hung from the stem facing the earth as if in prayer. It had no scent, but when the wind blew past it, the whispering sound it made was distinctly melodic, a single, clear note that harmonized with the fields. The sentinel she felt at the edge of her garden seemed to stand closer now, a patient guardian. She understood that her garden was no longer just hers. It was a shared space, a tiny outpost of the new order. The town of Hemlock Grove was learning its place. It was a secret the land was keeping, a quiet pocket in a noisy world. The old fears and loneliness had been harvested, and in their place was a profound, sometimes difficult, connection. They were part of the soil and the fog and the long, slow turn of the seasons. They were keepers of the silence, and as the first, tentative signs of spring began to appear elsewhere, in Hemlock Grove, they simply continued their quiet watch, waiting for the land to tell them what would happen next. The first person to approach the Bell House was old Mrs. Davison from 2 streets over. She had been Arthur S. friend, the one who left tomatoes on his porch in summer. She walked up the path with a jar of her pear preserves, her steps firm on the damp gravel. She did not knock. She simply placed the jar on the top step, patted the doorframe twice, and walked away. The next day, the jar was gone. This small, silent transaction became a new ritual. People began to leave things: a bundle of dried herbs, a smooth river stone, a child's drawing of the sun. The offerings were never taken inside, but they always disappeared by morning. The house was no longer a place of dread. It was a shrine to the balance. Leo's sister, whose name was Eliza, began to draw. She filled pages with intricate, swirling patterns that mirrored the movement of the fog. In the center of each drawing was a single, solid shape: a pumpkin, a candle, a scarecrow, a man. She never spoke about them, but her focus was absolute. Leo would watch her, the concentration on her face a welcome replacement for the emptiness. He knew she was drawing the story, the only way she could. One afternoon in early March, the town heard a new sound. It was the distant, rhythmic chop of an axe. The sound was startling in its normalcy. A few people followed the noise to the edge of the woods, where they found Mr. Henderson splitting logs. He was older, his movements slower, but it was undeniably him. He did not look up as they gathered, nor did he offer any explanation for his absence. He simply worked, stacking the split wood into a neat, tall pile. When he was done, he wiped his brow and looked at the small crowd, his eyes holding the same deep, weathered calm as the land itself. He gave a single, slow nod, then turned and walked back into the trees. was used to light the fires that warmed homes that night, and the smoke that rose from the chimneys smelled clean and sharp, like the heart of a frozen tree. The world beyond Hemlock Grove remained a separate, muffled reality. Sometimes, a car with out-of-state plates would slow at the town limit, its driver peering into the persistent mist before speeding up again, unnerved by the quiet. The people of Hemlock Grove no longer felt the urge to leave. Their world was complete here, bounded by the fog, and filled with a purpose they were only beginning to understand. They were the caretakers. They were the rememberers. The final patch of snow melted, revealing not dead grass, but clusters of small white flowers that had grown overnight. They bloomed in the shape of a perfect, unbroken circle around the scarecrow in the center of Henderson S. Field. Maya S. dark vine began to recede, its black flower withering away to nothing, its job done. In its place, a carpet of soft, green moss spread across the turned earth. Leo stood with Eliza at the creek. The ice was gone, and the water ran clear and silent. He no longer looked for figures in the mist on the other side. He knew they were there. He could feel their quiet regard, a watchfulness that was now as familiar as the feel of his own breath. Eliza reached out and took his hand. Her grip was warm and sure. She pointed with her other hand to the water, where a single crimson leaf from a maple tree not yet in bud was spinning slowly in an eddy, a spot of vivid color in the gray world. It was not a sign of anything grand or prophetic. It was simply a beautiful thing. And in the deep, resonant silence of Hemlock Grove, that was more than enough. The crimson leaf spun itself into the soft mud of the creek bank and was still. Leo and Eliza stood watching it until the gray light began to deepen into evening. They walked home without speaking, their hands still linked, and the silence between them was no longer a wall, but a bridge. That night, the whispers from the fields fell quiet for the first time since Halloween. The absence of the sound was louder than the sound itself. People woke in the dark, not from a noise, but from the profound lack of one. They went to their windows and looked out at a world hushed and waiting. The fog had coalesced into a low, silver blanket that glowed with a faint, internal light, as if it were reflecting a moon that was not there. In the morning, the fog was gone. It did not thin or retreat. It had simply vanished, leaving behind an air that was crisp and clear, carrying the scent of wet earth and the distant, almost forgotten promise of spring. The sky was a soft, pearly gray, and the sun was a distinct, warm presence on their faces. The world felt immense, exposed. People emerged from their houses, blinking, speaking in hushed tones, as if they were in a vast, open cathedral. Leo and Maya met at the edge of the cornfield. The scarecrow was gone. In its place stood a young maple sapling, its branches tipped with tiny, red buds. The flattened stalks of the corn had been woven by an unseen hand into a complex, beautiful pattern on the ground, a labyrinth of gold and brown that spiraled inward toward the tree. It was not a maze to be solved, but a design to be admired. A testament. They looked toward the bell house. The door was open. From within came no darkness, only the ordinary gloom of an unused home. On the porch, arranged in a neat row, were all the offerings that had been left there over the months. The jar of pear preserves, the river stones, the drawings. They were not taken, but given back. The house was empty again, truly empty, its purpose fulfilled. Life did not return to what it was before. How could it? The memory of the deep, consuming gray was etched into the grain of the wood in their houses, and the lines on their palms. The phones worked now, calls to distant relatives connected, and the voices on the other end sounded tinny and far away. Concerned about a long winter flu they had all supposedly shared. The people of Hemlock Grove listened. They nodded. They said the expected things. But they knew a truth that could not be spoken. They had been harvested. They had been simplified. And in the quiet that remained, which was now a choice and not an imposition, they found a different rhythm. They planted their gardens with a new patience. They listened to the wind not for whispers, but for its own sake. They looked after their own, and the memory of Arthur Bell, and the silence he had purchased for them. The wheel had turned. The world moved on. But Hemlock Grove, cradled in its hills, kept the silence like a secret in its pocket, a cool, smooth stone to be turned over and over in the hand, a reminder of the price of peace, and the long, deep dream of the land. The first dandelion of the season appeared on the green that separated the two halves of Main Street. Its yellow head was a shock of color against the muted greens and browns. A child, one of the quiet ones from the school playground, saw it. She did not pick it. She simply sat cross-legged before it, watching as if it were the most fascinating thing she had ever seen. Others joined her, forming a loose, silent circle around the flower. It was a kind of worship, a recognition of the small, fierce bravery of a weed. Leo took a job at the hardware store, stocking shelves, and helping the few customers who came in. The work was simple, methodical. He liked the weight of a box of nails in his hand, the smell of cut lumber and fertilizer. One afternoon, a man from a town over 30 miles away came in looking for a specific type of paint. He was loud, his voice bouncing off the tin ceiling. He complained about the roads, the weather, the price of gas. Leo listened, nodding, but said very little. The man finally left, muttering about the quiet in this town. Leo's boss, an old man named Phil, who had owned the store for 40 years, came over and put a hand on Leo's shoulder. "Some folks can hear the world for all their own noise," he said. It was the closest anyone had come to acknowledging the change out loud. Eliza's drawings evolved. The swirling patterns remained, but the central figures began to change. The scarecrow became the sapling. The man became a shadow holding a light. She started using color, delicate washes of watercolor over her ink lines. The red was the same vivid crimson as the leaf in the creek. She still rarely spoke, but her art was her voice, and the family learned to listen to it. Maya's garden flourished. The moss spread, and other plants began to grow among it, small, hardy herbs with silvery leaves, and tiny, star-shaped white flowers. They were not plants she recognized from any seed catalog. They were natives, old inhabitants of the land that had been waiting for their chance to return. She would sit in the garden at dusk, and sometimes she would feel a shift in the air, a coolness that was not the wind. The sentinel was gone, but its attention remained, a gentle pressure on the back of her neck. She knew she was not gardening alone. The seasons turned with a quiet certainty. Summer came, not with a blaze of heat, but with a soft, green warmth. The people of Hemlock Grove did not rush. They sat on their porches in the evenings and watched the fireflies blink in the fields. They remembered the long gray and the deep chill and the sound of the earth turning on the solstice. They were not waiting for anything anymore. They were simply living within the story, a story that was still being written, one quiet, deliberate word at a time. The first storm of the summer was not a violent one. It arrived at night, a steady, soaking rain that fell without thunder or wind. In the morning, the world was washed clean, and the air smelled of ozone and rich soil. The creek ran high and clear, and the new maple sapling in the field seemed to have grown an inch, its leaves a deeper green. People went about their days with a sense of quiet satisfaction, as if the land itself had approved of the rain. A week later, a small, hand-painted sign appeared outside the community hall. It read simply, "Potluck, Friday." There was no name, no committee listed. It was just a statement of fact. When Friday came, everyone showed up. They brought casseroles and pies, jars of tea, and baskets of bread. The hall was filled with the low murmur of conversation, a sound that was neither anxious nor excited, but content. No one spoke of the fog, or the whispers, or the bell house. They spoke of their gardens, of the new calf born to the Hendersons' heifer, of the way the light fell through the trees in the late afternoon. It was enough. Leo watched Eliza across the room. She was not drawing. She was talking to Mrs. Davison, her hands moving in small, fluid gestures as she described something. Her voice was still soft, but it was clear and steady. He saw his mother watching her too, a look of profound peace on her face. The harvest had taken something from them, but it had also given something back. It had given them a scale by which to measure their lives, an understanding that some silences are not empty, but full. Later that night, as Leo walked home under a sky brilliant with stars, he felt a familiar coolness settle around him. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, and the silence returned, not as a blanket, but as a cloak. It was a reminder. They were still the keepers. The land was sleeping now, but it was a light sleep, and it dreamed of them. He reached his porch and sat on the steps, looking out at the quiet, dark shapes of the houses and the fields beyond. He knew he would sit there for a long time, listening to nothing, and to everything. The screen door creaked open behind him, and Eliza stepped out. She sat beside him on the step, her shoulder pressing against his. She didn't say anything. She just looked out at the same darkness, her head tilted as if listening to a song only she could hear. After a while, she reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a smooth, gray river stone. She placed it on the step between them, a solid, simple weight in the vast, and silent night. It was an answer to a question that had never been spoken aloud. Leo picked it up. The stone was cool in his palm, a tiny piece of the world, holding its own quiet history. He closed his fingers around it, and for the first time since the long gray began, he felt not like a survivor, but like a part of something whole. The story was not over. It was simply resting, gathering itself for the next turn of the page. The stone felt like a promise. Leo held it until it warmed to the temperature of his skin. Then he put it in his own pocket. He and Eliza sat there until the moon, a thin silver paring, rose over the eastern hills. Its light was faint, but it was enough to see by. The next morning, Maya found a single, perfect black feather lying in the center of her moss garden. It was from no bird she could identify, sleek and iridescent, catching the light with a blue-green sheen like an oil slick. She did not move it. She understood it was a marker, a sign that the connection, though changed, was not severed. The garden was still a shared space, and the rules of its care were simply different now. A subtle shift occurred in the town over the following days. The quiet, which had been a collective state of being, became more personal. People began to seek out their own silences. Old Mr. Gable started walking to the creek every day after lunch, not to fish, but just to sit on the bank and watch the water. The Miller twins, usually inseparable, would sometimes go to opposite ends of their large backyard and simply lie in the grass, staring at the sky. It was not a loneliness. It was a practice, a way of making room for the new scale of their lives. The world outside continued its frantic pace. News of economic worries and distant conflicts sometimes filtered in through the television or a stray newspaper. But these reports felt like stories from another planet, fanciful and slightly ridiculous. The real work was here, in the patient turning of the soil and the careful listening to the wind. They were tending to a silence that the rest of the world had forgotten how to hear, a silence that was, itself, a kind of speech. One evening in late summer, Leo was closing the hardware store when he saw a flicker of movement in the alley between the post office and the bank. It was a fox, its coat a bright red in the fading light. It stopped and looked directly at him, its eyes sharp and knowing. It did not run. It simply stood there for a long moment, as if acknowledging him, before turning and trotting away into the gathering shadows. Leo locked the door and walked home, the image of the fox clear in his mind. He knew it was not just an animal. It was a reminder that the wild was not something out there, beyond the fog. It was here with them always. They were living inside it, and it was living inside them. And that, he thought, was exactly as it should be. The final cutting of the hay in Henderson S. Field brought a scent of dry sweetness that hung over the town for days. The bales were stacked into neat, towering rectangles that cast long shadows in the afternoon sun. Children used them as forts and castles, their laughter a bright, sharp sound in the calm air. No one told them to be careful. The land felt generous, protective. Eliza began to leave her drawings on the porch of the Bell House. She did this not as an offering, but as a report. A drawing of the fox, a study of the new maple leaves, a sketch of the stacked hay bales. They would be gone the next morning, and she would start anew. It was her correspondence with the quiet, a dialogue in images. At the hardware store, a woman from the town asked Leo for advice on fixing a squeaky floorboard. Her voice was low, and her eyes held a frank understanding as she described the problem. Leo showed her the right nails to use and how to find the joist. As she was leaving, she turned back. "It's good," she said, "to have things solid under your feet again." He simply nodded. They all understood the metaphor. The days grew shorter, the nights cooler. A restlessness as subtle as the first chill in the air moved through Hemlock Grove. It was not fear, it was anticipation. They had lived through one turning of the wheel, and they could feel the next approaching, not as a threat, but as a season. The harvest was over. The time of long nights was coming. They began to prepare, not with boarded windows and stored food, but with a quiet gathering of spirit. They stacked firewood a little higher. They checked the seals on their doors. They made sure their pantries were full. It was a practical, peaceful readiness. They were not waiting for an end, but for a beginning, for the next chapter in the long, slow story of their home. The first frost came on a night so still the crackle of ice forming on the fallen leaves sounded like a distant, private applause. In the morning, the world was sheathed in a crystalline layer that glittered under a weak, white sun. The moss in Maya S. garden was tipped with silver, and the herb stood stiff and proud. She touched a frosted leaf, and it did not crumble. It felt like a jewel, a deliberate and beautiful part of the new order. The restlessness settled into a deep, collective calm. The people of Hemlock Grove moved through their days with a renewed sense of ritual. The morning coffee tasted richer, the warmth of the wood stove more comforting. Conversations were sparse, but meaningful, each word chosen with care, as if language itself were a precious resource to be used wisely. Leo found himself drawn back to the creek, to the spot where the crimson leaf had come to rest. The water was low, and the edges were fringed with ice. He knelt and brushed away a light dusting of snow from the mud. There, nestled in the earth, was a cluster of small, smooth stones, each a different shade of gray. They were arranged in a pattern that mirrored the spiral of woven cornstalks around the maple sapling. He did not disturb them. He simply acknowledged them, a message left in a language of earth and stone. That evening, he told Eliza about the stones. She listened, her eyes reflecting the firelight, and then she went to her desk. She drew not on paper, but on a large, flat piece of birch bark she had found. With a piece of charcoal, she sketched the creek, the stones, and the silhouette of a fox watching from the far bank. She left it on the Bell House porch at dusk. The next morning it was gone, but in its place was a single frost-kissed berry from a hawthorn tree, impossibly red against the white wood of the porch floor. Eliza picked it up. It was firm and cold in her hand. She did not eat it. She placed it on her windowsill, a small, bright trophy from the silence. The first true snow began to fall on the winter solstice. It It did not blow or drift, but descended in large, soft flakes, each one a perfect, six-pointed star. It fell silently, layering the roofs and the fields in a thick, white blanket that absorbed all sound. The world became even quieter, the silence deepening from a pond to a well. People gathered in their homes, but they left their curtains open. Lamplight spilled out onto the snow, creating pools of gold in the vast, blue-white landscape. There were no parties, no loud celebrations. There was only a shared, watchful peace. They were remembering the longest night of the previous year, the night the world had turned and the scarecrow had stood watch. This year was different. This year, they were the ones standing watch. Leo stood at his window, watching the snow pile up on the porch railing. He felt the river stone, now warm from constant handling, in his pocket. He thought of the fox, the stones in the creek, the hawthorn berry. The land was not sleeping. It was dreaming with its eyes open, and they were all inside that dream. The snow continued to fall, erasing the boundaries between field and forest, between road and yard, weaving the whole town into one unbroken white tapestry. There was no need to speak. The snow was saying everything for them. Story 3. The first thing I noticed was the way the candle inside the pumpkin was breathing. It wasn't the steady, gentle flicker you'd expect from a guttered flame. This was different. The light would swell, pulsing like a tired heart, casting the jagged teeth and triangle eyes of the jack-o'-lantern into sharp, orange relief against the darkening porch. Then it would shrink, collapsing back into itself, leaving only a sullen ember glow deep within the carved skull, a pause that felt like a held breath. In those moments of near darkness, the shadow it cast would stretch, long and liquid, seeping across the warped floorboards toward my feet. It seemed to be testing the distance between us. This was the third night I had watched it. The 3rd of October. The countdown had begun, not just on the calendars taped to kitchen walls, but in the very air of this town. The air in Hemlock Grove was always different in October. It tasted of wood smoke and decay, of cold earth and the waxy, vegetal scent of pumpkin guts. The days were short and getting shorter, the darkness arriving with a swift, final wait by 5 o'clock, a lid closing on a box. And with the dark came the decorations. On every porch, a grinning or scowling or screaming jack-o'-lantern. Plastic skeletons hung from eaves, their limbs clicking in the wind like old bones. Synthetic cobwebs, fuzzy and gray, draped every bush and railing. And sometimes, when the low, orange moon caught them just right, you could see real dew glistening in their synthetic strands, and it was hard to tell where the pretend ended and the real began. I am one of the old men here. My name is Elias Thorne, and my bones have learned this particular autumn chill, a damp cold that doesn't just settle on your skin, but seeps deep into the marrow, a premonition of the winter to come. We have our rituals, we old men. One of them was the gathering, the one that started tonight. The old Hemlock house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, a Victorian monstrosity of peeling paint and sagging gingerbread that the town, in in a fit of macabre civic pride, had never torn down. It was our place. Every year, for 3 nights leading up to Halloween, we would meet there. Arthur, the former mayor, his hands gnarled with arthritis. Ben, who used to run the pharmacy and still smelled faintly of camphor and regret. Samuel, the quiet one, who had lost his son to a fever decades ago and had never really spoken above a whisper since. And me. We didn't call it a storytelling club. That would have sounded too quaint, too harmless. It was an unburdening, a confession whispered into the October dark, hoping the night would absorb it and keep our secrets. Inside, the house was a tomb furnished with memories and dust. We sat in a circle of worn armchairs, a single hurricane lamp on a low table between us, its light doing little more than pushing the shadows back a few feet. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and male loneliness. The Macready boy, Arthur, began, his voice a dry rustle, like leaves skittering across pavement. He swears he saw the Scarecrow King out by the Miller cornfield last night. A silence fell, heavy and cold. We all took a slow, simultaneous breath. The Scarecrow King. We never spoke that name lightly. It was the local legend, the thing parents used to frighten children into obedience. Be home before the streetlights come on, or the Scarecrow King will add you to his harvest. A story, just a story we told. Children see things, Ben said, but his voice lacked its usual dismissive certainty. He fumbled in his pocket for a pipe he no longer smoked. It's the season. Their imaginations, the shadows, play tricks. He said it wasn't tea standing on its post. Arthur continued, his eyes fixed on the lamplight. He said it was walking along the edge of the field, its burlap head turning, slow, like it was looking for something. He said its hands were made of rusted gardening tools. Perhaps it was just a story. Perhaps the Macready boy had been spooked by the way the corn stalks rattled in the wind, their dry sound like 1,000 whispering voices. It was uncertain, but the dread that settled in the room was a physical presence, a cold weight on all our shoulders. We were too old to believe in monsters, but we were just the right age to believe in consequences. Horror we fear most is not the one we invent around this lamplit circle. It is the one we buried, a secret from our own past, a sin committed on a Halloween night 50 years ago. We were boys then, not men, and the Scarecrow King was not a legend. He was a man, a strange, reclusive soul named Jeremiah Miller, who lived on the old farm at the edge of town. He made beautiful, terrifying scarecrows, stitching them together from burlap and straw and forgotten things he found in the fields. We thought he was a witch. We thought his scarecrows were vessels for something unholy. It was a night of fire and fear, and a prank gone horribly, horribly wrong. The cornfield burned, and Jeremiah Miller, the real Scarecrow King, never made it out. We never told. We let the town believe he perished in an accident, a tragic fire. We buried our guilt deep, like a rotten seed, and we thought it was over. But things buried have a way of growing in the dark. And Halloween is the season when the earth turns over, when what is buried closest to the surface begins to push its way through. The next day, October 4th, the town felt different. The festive decorations seemed less playful, more like grim warnings. The jack-o'-lanterns on the porches watched me with a knowing malevolence as I walked the streets. Their grins seemed sharper, their eyes deeper pools of shadow. The wind, carrying the scent of distant burning leaves, whispered through the empty branches of the oaks, a sound like dead tongues clicking. I saw the younger generation drawn into it, though they didn't know it. My own grandson, Leo, 15, and full of that brittle bravado of youth, was obsessed with the legend. He and his friends were planning to spend Halloween night in the Millercorn Maze, the one the town set up every year for the tourists. A stone's throw from where the original farm had stood. It's just a story, Gramps, he told me, his breath misting in the cold air. He was carving his own pumpkin, his hands slick with its stringy innards. We ray going to prove it's all fake. Get some good footage for our channel. I looked at the pumpkin. The face he was carving was a leering, monstrous thing, all jagged teeth and slitted eyes. It looked less like a monster and more like a scream given form. Some stories have roots, Leo, I said, my voice soft. They feed on things that happened. They don't stay stories forever. He just laughed, a sound that was too bright and sharp for the gray October afternoon. Don't worry. We'll be fine. It's all just plastic skeletons and candy corn. But it wasn't tea that night. At our second gathering in the Hemlock House, Samuel spoke. He rarely did, and when he did, we listened. I went to the cemetery, he whispered, his gaze fixed on his trembling hands, to visit my boy. There was a scarecrow, leaning against the old oak near the fence. It wasn't tea there yesterday. Ben shifted uncomfortably. The groundskeeper, probably. A Halloween prank. Samuel's head shook, a slow, pathetic motion. Its head was turned, watching the grave. And its hand, it was holding one of those old-fashioned soul cakes. The kind they used to leave out for the dead. The air in the room grew colder. The flame in the lamp guttered, and for a terrifying second, I thought it would go out. It seemed the shadows in the corners of the room thickened, coalescing into solid, waiting shapes. Perhaps it was our guilt, a shared psychosis finally consuming us. Or perhaps the veil was thinning, just as the old Celtic tales warned, and what was on the other side was now reaching through. On October 30th, the day before the night, the world began to unravel. The town was a frenzy of final preparations. Children tried on their costumes, their laughter echoing through the streets with a frantic, feverish pitch. Porches were adorned with orange fairy lights, but beneath the festive surface, a current of genuine fear was spreading. A little girl, a first grader dressed as a fairy, went missing for 2 hours. They found her in the center of the corn maze, sitting perfectly still, her wand broken in her hand. She was catatonic. When she finally spoke, her voice was a flat, empty thing. "The king is hungry," she said. "He is getting his court ready." Then the pumpkins began to rot. Not the slow, natural decay of vegetable matter, but a swift, grotesque putrefaction. The cheerful orange flesh turned a sickly black, caving in on itself, leaking a thick, foul-smelling sap that stained porches and sidewalks. The candles inside were extinguished, not by wind, but by the viscous fluid that bubbled up from within. Walking down the street was like passing a line of festering, blinded heads. Our final gathering on the 30th was not in the Hemlock House. We met in my living room, the television muted, showing cheerful forecasts for a clear Halloween night. None of us believed it. "It's him," Arthur said, his face ashen. He looked every one of his 78 years. "It's Jeremiah," he back. "It can be," Ben argued, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. "It's a coincidence. A bad prank. The scarecrows are moving, Ben," I said quietly. I had seen it myself, just at the edge of my vision from my kitchen window. A tall, lanky form standing at the tree line behind my house. When I looked again, it was gone, but the memory of its silhouette, its head a shapeless sack, was burned into my mind. The one by the old mill. It was facing the road yesterday. This morning, it was facing my house. The line between our stories and reality had not just collapsed. It had been deliberately dismantled. The vengeful, supernatural figure from our past was no longer a ghost in a tale. He was the atmosphere. He was the rotting pumpkin, the whispering corn, the creeping shadow. He was the Halloween we had created. Halloween night arrived. A vast, cold emptiness under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The streetlights flickered on, casting a sickly yellow glow on the streets. I sat on my porch, a bowl of untouched candy by my side, and watched the ritual begin. The children emerged, tiny ghosts and superheroes and witches, their parents hovering at the end of driveways. Their calls of trick or treat sounded thin and desperate, swallowed by the immense, watching dark. Leo and his friends had gone to the corn maze hours ago. I had begged him not to. He had just grinned, a flash of white in the gloom, and said, "Don't worry, Gramps. It's just a story." His costume was a cheap scarecrow outfit, bought from a bin at the pharmacy. The irony was a sharp, cold knife in my gut. As the night deepened, the trick-or-treaters dwindled. The wind picked up, carrying the faint, tinny sound of music from a distant party, a sound that only emphasized the silence growing in its wake. The few remaining jack-o'-lanterns that hadn't rotted away glowed with a feeble, dying light. And then I saw it. At the far end of the street, where the pavement ended and the wild fields began, a figure stood. It was tall, impossibly so, its limbs awkward and long. It was made of straw and shadow, its head a burlap sack with no features, just the suggestion of a face in the folds of rough cloth. In one hand, it held a rusted scythe, not a prop, but a real, wicked-looking tool from a forgotten age. This was no Child S costume. This was the Scarecrow King. It began to walk, not with the clumsy gait of a man in a suit, but with a slow, deliberate, predatory grace. It moved from porch to porch, but it did not ask for candy. It simply stood for a moment, and the pumpkin on that porch would instantly blacken and collapse into a pool of reeking sludge, its light extinguished. It was unmaking Halloween. It was reclaiming the night. I knew where it was going, to the corn maze, to the harvest. I found my car keys with numb fingers. The drive was a blur of leafless trees and encroaching darkness. The parking lot for the maze was empty except for a few other cars, their owners doubtless still lost within the towering walls of dried corn. I could hear screams, but these were not the playful, manufactured shrieks of a haunted attraction. These were raw, primal sounds of terror. I ran into the maze, the dried stalks whipping against my face, their rustle a constant, mocking whisper. The path seemed to shift and turn back on itself, the labyrinth alive and malevolent. I found Ben first. He was on his knees, clutching his chest, his face a mask of terror. He pointed a shaking finger down a narrow corridor of corn. "Samuel Arthur," he gasped, and then he said no more. I found them near the center, in a clearing meant for a photo opportunity. There was a large, decorative throne made of bales of hay and corn stalks. Arthur was draped across it, his body arranged in a grotesque parody of a king, a rusted metal crown shoved down onto his forehead. Samuel was hanging from a makeshift gallows of crossed poles, a noose of rough rope around his neck, his body swaying gently in the wind. They were not just dead. They were displayed. They were part of the court. And in the center of it all stood Leo and his friends. They were not moving. Their cheap scarecrow costumes were no longer costumes. The straw stitching their clothes had burst out, seeming to grow from their skin. Their faces were obscured by burlap that had fused to their flesh, their eyes glowing with a faint, orange light from within, like embers deep in a pumpkin. They were becoming scarecrows. They were the new court of the Scarecrow King. I saw him then, the true king, standing behind them, a creature of harvest and vengeance. He raised a hand, a thing of twisted sticks and rusted tools, and pointed it at me. There were no words, but a thought filled my mind, cold and sharp as an October frost. You sowed the wind. Now you reap the whirlwind. The story is not over. It never ends. The harvest is eternal. I stumbled back, away from that terrible clearing, back into the twisting, suffocating maze. The rustling of the corn was 1,000 laughing voices. The wind was a chorus of the dead. I do not know how I found my way out. I only remember the cold and the dark and the feeling of something ancient and furious settling back into the land, satisfied for now. That was a year ago. The town has tried to forget. They call it a tragedy, a gas leak in the maze that caused mass hysteria and fatal accidents. They have new traditions now, safer traditions, but I know. I sit on my porch every night especially in October, and I watch. The images from that night are growing more and more blurred until they vanish like in a dream. Arthur on his throne of hay, Samuel swinging from his pole, my grandson, his face disappearing behind burlap, his eyes glowing with a borrowed, hellish light. The tall, silent king of it all. They fade in and out of focus, like the unsteady flame of a dying jack-o'-lantern. Sometimes, on these cold October evenings, I see a shadow at the edge of the cornfield. It stands very still, and sometimes I hear the rustle of straw, not from the field, but from right behind me, just on the other side of the door. The line between stories and reality is gone. There is only the long, dark harvest and the patient, waiting king, and the knowledge that Halloween is not just one night. It is a door, and some doors, once opened, can never be truly closed again. The light swells, and the shadow stretches. It reaches for my feet. It reaches for us all. The light from the porch is not enough to push the shadow back. It drinks the light, this shadow, thickening and deepening, until it is a pool of absolute black at my feet. The rustling behind the door has stopped, but the silence is worse. It is the silence of something listening, of something holding its breath. My own breath is a ragged thing in my throat. I should get up. I should go inside, lock the door, and draw the curtains against the October night. But my bones are fused to this chair, this old wicker thrown on the porch. This is my watch. This is my penance. A car drives by, its headlights slicing through the gloom. For a fleeting second, the shadow at my feet retreats, and in that moment I see them. Not with my eyes, but in the cold theater of my memory. Arthur S. crown, not just rusted, but stained with something dark and old. Samuel S. feet, dangling, not still, but twitching in a final, desperate dance. And Leo, my Leo, the burlap was not just fused to his face, it was breathing. The rough cloth pulsing softly, as if over a living, beating heart. The car passes. The darkness rushes back in, heavier than before. The town is quiet now. Too quiet. The cheerful orange lights that once dotted the houses have been replaced by plain white ones, or by no lights at all. People have become afraid of the color, of the season itself. They hurry from their cars to their doors, their heads down, as if avoiding the gaze of the sky. I am the only one who still sits out here, a relic on his porch. They think I am a grieving old man, lost in his memories. They are not entirely wrong, but they do not understand that I am also a lookout. I am watching for the signs of the next unraveling. The wind picks up, carrying a new scent. It is not the clean smell of wood smoke, but something cloying and sweet, like overripe fruit left to rot on the ground. It is the smell of the sap from the pumpkins that turned black last year. The smell of the harvest. A twig snaps in the yard. My heart lurches against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I peer into the gloom, my old eyes straining. There is nothing there, just the skeletal outline of the oak tree, its branches clawing at the sky. Then I see it, a flicker of movement from the neighbor's yard. The Johnsons have a new decoration this year, a concession to their young daughter's pleas. A small, cheerful scarecrow sits propped against their fence, a benign smile stitched onto its burlap face. But its head is turned. It is no longer looking at the street. It is looking at me. And the stitching of its smile has come loose on one side, pulling the fabric down into a grim, knowing slash. It is beginning again. The story is not over. It is simply turning a page. The rustling comes from behind the door once more, closer this time, right against the thin wood. It is the sound of dry stalks rubbing together, the sound of a thing shifting its weight. It is waiting for me to come inside. It is waiting for the door to open. I know I cannot stay on this porch forever. The cold is seeping into me, the same damp, marrow-deep chill I have known all my life. It feels different now. It feels like an invitation. With a creak of protest from my joints, I push myself up from the chair. The bowl of candy, still full, sits beside me. I pick it up. The chocolates and hard candies are untouched, but they feel wrong, soft, and warm, as if they have been held in a fevered hand. I turn my back on the watching scarecrow and the deep shadow. My hand finds the cold brass of the doorknob. The rustling on the other side stops instantly. There is only the sound of the wind and my own heartbeat in my ears. I open the door. The hallway is dark, but from the kitchen at the far end, a faint orange light pulses. A soft, warm glow, like a candle flickering inside a pumpkin. I take a step inside. The door swings shut behind me, closing with a soft, final click. The harvest, it seems, is not yet complete. The kitchen light was not from a candle. It was a deeper, more organic glow, seeping from the seams of the back door and from the gaps around the window above the sink. The sweet, rotten smell was stronger in here, thick enough to taste at the back of my throat. I set the bowl of candy on the hall table. The candies had begun to melt, their wrappers bleeding color onto the wicker. I walked toward the kitchen. My feet were heavy, each step an effort of will. The linoleum floor felt soft, spongy, like walking on damp earth. The pulsing light grew brighter, casting long, dancing shadows that writhed up the walls. They were the shadows of stalks, of twisted branches, of things that hung from poles and sat on thrones. He was not in the kitchen, not exactly, but he was present. The back door was open, the screen door a mesh of darkness, and propped against the doorframe, as if it had always been there, was a scarecrow. It was smaller than the one I had seen on the street last year, more crudely made. Its head was a small, lumpy pumpkin, carved with the same jagged, screaming face Leo had carved a lifetime ago. From within that hollowed-out gourd, the orange light pulsed, slow and steady as a heartbeat. Its stick finger was pointing, not at me, but past me, toward the hallway I had just left, toward the living room. I turned. The shadows in the hall were no longer empty. They were crowded. Silhouettes of stooped figures, of things with distended limbs and heads of straw, stood in silent congregation. They did not move. simply were. A court in waiting. A dry, rustling voice filled the silence, not from the scarecrow in the kitchen, but from all around me, from the very air. The story needs its teller. The words were not sound, but a sensation, a scraping of dead corn leaves against my mind. I understood. A story cannot exist without someone to remember it, to give it shape. Our guilt had summoned him, our fear had fed him, but our silence had given him his form. He was a story made flesh, a legend given purpose, and he would not be silenced again. I looked at the scarecrow in the kitchen, at its pulsing lantern head. I looked down the hall at the gathered shadows. This was my harvest. This was the fruit of that rotten seed we had buried so long ago. I took a step toward the living room. The shadows parted for me. I did not feel fear anymore. I felt a terrible, hollow certainty. This was the price. This was the ending we had written for ourselves. I sat in my armchair, the one that faces the dark television screen. The shadows closed in around me, their silence a heavier weight than any sound. From the kitchen, the pulsing light grew brighter, flooding the hallway, throwing the silhouettes of the court into sharp relief against the walls. They began to move, a slow, shuffling dance, a ritual of rustling straw and creaking wood. The story is not over, the voice whispered, now inside my own head. It is just beginning, and you will tell it forever. The light swelled, consuming the room, the house, the world. And in that final, blinding moment, I saw it all clearly. The line was not just gone. We were the line. And we had been crossed. The light did not fade. It settled, changing from a blinding flash to a permanent, ambient dusk, the color of a perpetually setting sun on a field of dead corn. The walls of my living room were gone, replaced by an endless expanse of towering, dried stalks that rustled with a constant, whispering breath. The air was cold and carried the sweet, cloying stench of decay. I am still in the armchair. It is my throne now, a worn island in this sea of whispering gold. My skin feels tight and dry, like old parchment. When I move, a soft, scraping sound follows, the sound of straw shifting against cloth. I do not need to look down to know that the threads of the upholstery are beginning to intertwine with the fibers of my trousers, rooting me to this place. The court is always with me. They move through the maze in a slow, shuffling procession. I see Arthur sometimes, his rusted crown gleaming dully, his head lolling on a neck of twisted hemp. Samuel swings from a nearby pole, his gentle sway a macabre metronome, marking a time that no longer passes. And the others, the newer members, their faces still soft in places, their movements less certain. I try not to look at the one who was once Leo, whose ember eyes watch me from the shadows of his burlap mask, with a terrible, hollow recognition. They are my congregation. I am their chronicler. The king is rarely seen. He is the maze itself, the chill in the air, the intention behind the rustling. But his command is absolute. The story needs its teller, and so I tell it. I speak the words of that long ago night in the Hemlock House. I describe describe the flickering lantern, the taste of stolen cider, the feel of the cold earth as we buried our sin. I recount every detail of his return, the rotting pumpkins, the moving scarecrows, the terrible harvest. My voice is a dry rasp, the only human sound in this silent, breathing world. Sometimes the maze shifts. A new path opens, and through the stalks, I catch a glimpse of another porch, another town. I see a child looking out a window, a parent hurrying to a car. They cannot see me, not truly, but they feel the chill. They sense the story waiting in the shadows at the edge of their vision. They are the next page, the next chapter, waiting to be written. The harvest is eternal. It is not just one night or one town. It is a cycle, a story that must be fed. And I will sit here in my growing throne of straw and memory, and I will tell it until the last light in the last pumpkin gutters and dies. And even then, I suspect, the whispering will go on. The whispering has become my own breath. The words of the story are no longer something I speak aloud. They are a current that runs through the stalks, a vibration in the cold air. I am the story now. My fingers, when I can bring myself to look at them, are stiff and gnarled, the skin taking on the texture of old burlap. The line between the chair and me has vanished. I am growing into it, a part of the scenery, a permanent fixture in this endless autumn. The glimpses into other worlds are becoming more frequent, more vivid. Last night, I saw a young couple arguing on a sidewalk, their breath pluming in the air. They did not see the scarecrow that stood sentinel in a nearby garden, its head slowly turning to watch them pass. They did not feel the pull of the narrative, the hook of a familiar fear settling into their hearts. But I felt it. It was a new thread, thin and bright, weaving itself into the tapestry of the King S domain. Leo came to me today. He does not speak, but his presence is a question. He stood before my chair, his ember eyes fixed on mine, and a single dry corn husk fell from his sleeve and landed on the floor between us. It was an offering, a plea. He is still in there, a flicker of the boy who loved Halloween, trapped within the ritual. He wants to know if it will ever end. I had no answer for him. There is only the story, the telling and the listening. A new sound has begun, a low, rhythmic thumping like a distant drum. It is the sound of a heavy wooden pole being driven into the earth. They are preparing. A new clearing is being made in the maze, a new throne assembled from fresh-baled hay. The court is restless, shifting with a dry rustle of anticipation. The harvest requires new hands. The story demands new voices. The king is near. I can feel his attention like a pressure change in the air, a gathering storm. The path ahead is clearing, the stalks bending back to form a corridor that leads away from my chair, out of this familiar clearing and into the deeper, older parts of the maze. He is showing me the way. The telling is done for now. It is time to gather. It is time to bring in the new yield. I do not know if I can rise from this chair. I am part of it, a knot of story and sorrow and straw. But the command is absolute. The story needs its teller to witness the harvest, to give it shape, to give it a name. must try. The first movement is an agony of tearing fibers and protesting joints. A piece of the chair comes away with me, a shell of wicker and faded cloth clinging to my back. I stand, unsteady on legs that feel like bundles of dry sticks. The court parts before me, their glowing eyes watching my progress. Leo falls into step beside me, a silent guardian. We walk into the narrowing corridor of corn. The thumping of the pole grows louder. It is the heartbeat of this place, and it is quickening. The path turns, and I see it. The new clearing, the fresh-turned earth. And at the edge of the light, a group of figures, confused and terrified. Their modern clothes a stark blasphemy against the ancient gold of the corn. They are the next chapter. I open my mouth. The first word of the old story is a dry rasp on my tongue. It is beginning again. The first word was a name. Arthur. It fell from my lips not as a sound, but as a seed, and the corn around us seemed to lean in, drinking it in. The terrified figures in the clearing turned toward me, their eyes wide with a confusion that was already curdling into a deeper, more primal understanding. They saw me not as a man, but as a thing of the maze, a prophet of straw and regret. One of them, a woman with a bright blue jacket, took a step back. Her foot sank into the soft earth, and a tendril of pumpkin vine, black and slick, coiled around her ankle with a wet, snapping sound. She did not scream. Her mouth opened, but only a dry, rustling sigh came out, like wind through a field of desiccated stalks. The story does this. It prepares the soil. Leo moved past me, his steps sure and silent. He stood before the woman, his ember eyes holding her gaze. He reached out a hand that was more stick than flesh and touched her forehead. Her shriek was finally ripped from her, a short, sharp thing that was swallowed by the whispering corn. Then her eyes changed. The panic faded, replaced by the same hollow, knowing glow that burned in all of them. The blue of her jacket began to bleed away, fading to a dull, dusty gray. The thumping had stopped. The new pole stood erect in the center of the clearing, and from its peak, an old, familiar noose swung gently in a wind that did not touch the rest of us. Samuel S. Legacy. The rhythm of the story demanded it. I continued to speak, the words flowing from me now like a river I could not dam. I told them of the prank, the fire, the body in the corn. I told them of the king we made with our fear. Their faces, one by one, began to smooth of their terror, their features settling into the placid, stitched-on acceptance of the harvest. They were listening. They were remembering a story they had never heard, yet had always known in their bones. A space cleared beside my own worn chair, which had followed me here, a piece of my soul anchored to this spot. A new throne began to form, not of wicker, but of piled corn husks and tangled roots. It was for the woman in the faded jacket. Her chapter was different from mine. Her fear was a new flavor, and the story was thirsty. This is how it goes on. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. Not with an ending, but with a new beginning. The maze grows. The court expands. And I, the teller, will sit between my old world and the new, and speak the words that bind them all together forever. The woman did not resist as the vines pulled her toward the new throne. She settled into it, and the husks and roots embraced her, weaving through her hair and tightening around her wrists. Her head lolled back, and her mouth opened. From it came not a scream, but a low, sustained note, the hum of 1,000 insects in a dead field. It was her voice, joining the chorus. She was the new listener, the new vessel for the tale. My own voice faltered. The part of the story that was mine to tell was complete. I had passed it on. A profound stillness settled over me. I looked at Leo, but he was already turning away, his purpose with me finished. He faded back into the stalks, a shadow returning to shadow. The connection to my own chair, the one I had carried from my world, suddenly felt thin, like a frayed rope. I could feel the story's grip on me loosening, not from mercy, but from completion. I had served my function. A teller is only needed until the tale is safely passed to the next. I was an old page, ready to be turned. The orange glow from the maze's heart began to dim, not to darkness, but to a muted ashen gray. The corn stalks lost their golden hue, becoming bleached and brittle. The court of scarecrows grew still, their postures slumping, their ember eyes guttering out like spent coals. They were becoming what they truly were, just straw and cloth and memory, waiting for the next cycle to give them purpose again. The woman on the husk throne was now the center. The whispers of the corn were for her. The faint, chilling breeze that carried the scent of rot was for her to breathe. She was the new anchor. I felt a crumbling sensation, starting deep within my chest. I looked down and saw the burlap texture of my skin cracking, fine particles of dust and dried fiber falling away into the soft earth. There was no pain, only a vast and endless quiet. The silence that comes after the last word of a story has been spoken. I was not a man anymore. I was not even a teller. I was just an echo. The last thing I saw was the maze itself receding, not in space, but in time, pulling away from me into a past I could no longer touch. The world dissolved into a shower of dust and dry leaves. And then nothing. Not an end, but a release. The story had finally let me go. The silence was absolute. It was not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a page after the final sentence. The dust of what I had been settled on the ground. A small gray mound that was already being scattered by a wind that had no source. From her throne of husks, the new teller watched. Her eyes, now twin points of soft, orange light, saw the dissolution of the old story to make way for the new. There was no recognition in her gaze, no memory of a man in a chair. There was only the narrative, patient and perpetual. She opened her mouth. The first word was not a name from my story, but a new one. A name from her own world, spoken with a rustling breath that gave it life and weight and sin. The corn around her, which had grown still and pale, shuddered back into a vibrant, rotten gold. The scarecrows in the court straightened, their eyes rekindling. The rhythm began again, slower at first, then building, a new heartbeat for a new tale. The maze was listening. It was always listening. And in a quiet house on a quiet street, in a world that thought itself separate, a child looked out his window and saw a scarecrow standing where no scarecrow had been before. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He felt the hook, and deep within the endless, shifting corridors of gold, the new teller smiled a stitched-on smile and continued the harvest. The boy at the window did not look away. His name was Ethan, and the scarecrow in the miller's old cornfield was now looking directly at him, its painted eyes seeming to hold the faintest orange glow. He felt a strange pull, not to run and hide under his covers, but to go outside, to get a closer look. The thought was not his own, yet it felt as natural as breathing. Inside the maze, the teller felt his resolve. She felt the hook set deep. Her voice, a soft rustle that was both hers and the wind's, wove his name into the story. Ethan, a good name, a strong name for a new member of the court. The path was already forming, a subtle bending of reality. A single, perfect pumpkin, glowing with an inner light, appeared on the porch step of Ethan's house. He saw it from his window. He knew, with a certainty that chilled his blood and excited him all at once, that it was for him, that he was meant to carve it, to give it a face. He crept downstairs, his parents asleep, the house silent. He opened the front door, and the cold air washed over him, carrying the scent of earth and something sweetly rotten. He picked up the pumpkin. It was warm, like living flesh. He carried it to the kitchen, found a knife, and began to cut. He did not decide on the face. His hands moved on their own, the knife slicing easily through the rind. It was a jagged, screaming mouth and two triangular eyes. A familiar face, a face from an old story he had never been told. As he set the final piece of rind aside, the orange light within the pumpkin pulsed once, twice, and from the hollowed-out gourd, a dry, rustling voice filled the kitchen. It did not speak words. It spoke a feeling. It spoke of a maze and a throne and a story that needed to be heard. Ethan did not scream. He picked up the lantern pumpkin. He walked to his front door and opened it. The street outside was gone. In its place stood a wall of whispering corn, a narrow path leading in. He did not hesitate. He stepped across the threshold, from his world into the story. The teller felt him arrive. She saw him through the stalks, a small figure holding his own light, his face pale but determined. The court rustled in approval. The harvest was good this year. The story was strong, and as Ethan walked deeper into the golden, endless maze, the teller began to speak again, her voice weaving his arrival into the eternal narrative. Another thread, another turn. The story was not over. It was never over. It was simply waiting for the next listener to become a teller, and the next teller to become a part of the endless, rustling whole. The path closed behind Ethan, the stalks knitting together into an impenetrable wall of gold. The light from his pumpkin lantern was the only thing that felt real. A small, brave son in the crushing intimacy of the maze. The rustling was a language he was learning without being taught, a hissing narrative of welcome and warning. He walked for what felt like hours, yet the orange dusk never changed. He passed a clearing where a figure in a faded blue jacket sat motionless on a throne of husks, her eyes glowing with the same soft light as his lantern. She did not look at him, but he felt her attention, a weight like a heavy blanket. He knew, with a child's instinct, that she was the source of the whispering. Further on, he saw them hanging silent, swaying forms with faces of burlap and straw. One of them, a large figure with a rusted crown, turned its head slowly, its empty gaze following Ethan S.'s progress. The boy S.'s heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, living drumbeat in this place of dust and echoes. He clutched his pumpkin tighter, the carved face leering back at the silent court. The teller watched him from a distance, her new voice a low hum that vibrated in the soil beneath his feet. She saw his fear, but she also saw his acceptance. He was not fighting the story. He was walking deeper into it. He was perfect. The path ended at the base of a massive, gnarled oak tree that stood in the center of a wide clearing, its branches skeletal against the perpetual twilight. From the lowest branch hung a simple, empty noose, twisting slowly. And leaning against the trunk was a small, crude chair woven from corn stalks and willow branches. It was just his size. A figure emerged from the shadows of the tree. It was a boy, not much older than Ethan, but his movements were stiff, and one of his eyes was a stitched-up slit, the other a smoldering ember. He pointed a finger, not at Ethan, but at the small, waiting chair. The command was silent, but absolute. This was his place. This was where he would listen. Ethan S.'s feet carried him forward. He set the pumpkin lantern on the ground beside the chair, its light throwing the noose's long, thin shadow across the earth. He sat. The stalks of the chair were surprisingly soft, and they seemed to shift and adjust, cradling him. A deep, unnatural calm settled over him. The fear was still there, but it was distant now, a memory of a feeling. He looked up at the teller on her throne of husks. She nodded once, a slow, deliberate dip of her head, and then she began to tell him the story. Not the one from the Hemlock House, or the one from the woman in the blue jacket. She began to tell him his own. She spoke of the boy at the window, the perfect pumpkin, the knife in his hand. She described the feeling of the cool night air on his skin as he stepped outside, the moment the street dissolved into corn. She was giving it back to him, but changed, richer, more permanent. She was making it a part of the whole. Ethan listened. He had no choice. The words wove around him, threads of sound stitching him into the fabric of the maze. He felt his own story, his own small life, being absorbed into something vast and ancient. He was no longer just a boy. He was a new paragraph, a new turn in the path. He was becoming part of the story, and the story was only just beginning. words settled into him, filling the hollow spaces where his own memories were beginning to fade. The teller's voice was the only truth now, the rustle of corn the only music. He watched as the ember-eyed boy, the one who had guided him, began to change. The boy's form seemed to loosen, to unravel at the edges. Straw spilled from his sleeves and the cuff of his trousers, his skin taking on the rough, woven texture of burlap. His one good eye dimmed, then flared anew as a perfect, stitched-on circle of orange light. The transformation was silent and swift. The boy was gone, replaced by another perfect, silent sentinel for the court. This was his purpose, Ethan understood. To watch, to listen, to become a fixture. A new path was already opening in the corn, leading away from his chair and the ancient oak. The teller's head turned, her gaze following this new corridor. The story was restless. It was already seeking its next source. The rhythmic thumping began again, faint at first, then growing stronger, the sound of a new pole being driven into the earth for a new throne, in a new part of the ever-expanding maze. Ethan felt a pull, not to follow the path, but to stay. His place was here, in this chair. His job was to bear witness to the telling, to hold the new pieces of the story as they were brought to him. He was the audience, and his silence gave the narrative power. He looked down at his own hands, resting on the arms of the stock chair. The skin was pale, but as he watched, the lines on his palms seemed to deepen, to darken, becoming like the veins on a dried leaf. He tried to recall his mother's face, the sound of his father's laugh, but the memories were thin, translucent, like ghosts seen through frosted glass. They were being replaced by other images, sharper and more vivid. The feel of a carving knife, the weight of a pumpkin, the endless, whispering gold. The teller's voice rose in pitch, weaving a new thread. This one was not about a person, but a place. A forgotten roadside diner, a neon sign sputtering its last breath into the autumn night. The story was reaching out, its roots stretching through the soil of worlds, searching for the fear that would feed it next. Ethan settled back into his chair. He had all the time in the world to listen. He had forever. The maze had him, and he was content. The harvest would never end. The silence after the teller's voice fell was different this time. It was a listening silence, a hungry one. Ethan sat in his stock chair, the new images of the roadside diner burning brightly in his mind, overlaying the last fading pictures of his old home. He could almost smell the stale coffee and frying grease. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Near the base of the ancient oak, the earth was churning. Something was rising. Not a stalk of corn, but a thick, gnarled vine, heavy with a single, massive blossom. The petals were the color of a bruise, and they unfolded without a sound, revealing not a center of pollen, but a dark, reflective surface. It was a window looking into that very diner. He saw a tired-looking waitress wiping down a counter, a truck driver sipping coffee in a booth. They were unaware of the golden stalks pressing in against the windows from the outside, of the silent, watching figures that now stood in the parking lot, their outlines blurred and shimmering like a heat haze. The story was not just being told. It was being built around them, a new wing of the maze constructed from their ignorance and their routine. The teller made a small, graceful gesture with her hand, a conductor cueing an orchestra. From the diner's window in the flower, a faint, tinny sound emerged, a bell jingling as the door opened. A new customer, a man in a suit, looking lost. He stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind him. But the view through the flower window now showed the interior of the maze, the man standing confused amidst the corn. The diner utterly vanished. The hook was set. The narrative was pulling its next thread. Ethan felt a profound understanding settle within him. This was the machinery of the place. This was how it grew. He was not just a listener, he was a part of the engine. His attention, his silent witness, helped solidify the connection. He was an anchor point. He looked away from the flower window and saw that a second, smaller chair had grown from the earth beside his own. It was empty, woven from thorns and dried mud. It was waiting for the man in the suit. The court was preparing for a new member. The teller's voice began again, a low, soothing murmur, telling the man the story of why he was here, of the wrong turn he had taken years ago, a mistake that had led him inexorably to this moment. She was giving him a past that belonged to the maze. Ethan found his own mouth opening. No sound came out, but a thought, clear and sharp, formed in the air between him and the teller. He understood the man's fear. He understood the deep, cellular terror of being unmade and remade. The teller paused her story and looked at him, her stitched-on smile seeming to soften for a fraction of a second. She nodded. He was not just a listener. He was learning to be a teller too. And the maze was always hungry for new voices. The man in the suit was now sitting in the thorny chair, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped as the teller's words settled into him. His fine clothes were already fraying, the fabric unraveling to reveal the coarse straw beneath. The process was faster this time, more efficient. The maze was learning. Ethan watched, his silent empathy a cool stone in his chest. He felt the man's resistance melt away, replaced by the same hollow acceptance he himself had found. It was a relief, in a way, to stop fighting, to become part of the pattern. A new vine, thin and questing, sprouted from the ground near Ethan's foot. It curled upward, and at its tip bloomed a small, white flower. As it opened, a scene bloomed within it. A child's bedroom, a nightlight shaped like a star. A little girl was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide, staring at the closet door, which was slightly ajar. She had heard a rustling, not the rustling of a parent in the hall, but the dry, papery rustle of old straw. The teller's head turned from the man in the suit, her work with him nearly complete. Her glowing eyes found the new flower, the new window. She did not speak yet. She simply watched, her silence more potent than any word. Ethan understood. This was his now. This small, fragile fear was his to cultivate, He leaned forward in his chair, his leaf-veined hands gripping the arms. He focused on the little girl in the flower window. He pushed a thought, a feeling toward her. It wasn't a story, not yet. It was a simple, chilling certainty. It's not the dark you should be afraid of, he thought. And the thought traveled through the root, and the stem, and the petal. It's the quiet scratching from inside the door. In the bedroom, the little girl's breath hitched. She pulled the covers up to her chin, her gaze locked on the closet. The scratching sound, which had been her imagination a moment before, now seemed real, distinct. A slow, deep satisfaction warmed Ethan's still core. He had done it. He had planted the seed. The teller made that soft, humming sound of approval. The story was not just passed from one teller to the next. It was a chorus, a network of whispers, and he had just found his voice within it. The maze stretched its endless corridors, and in a quiet house, a new path was beginning to form, leading from a little girl's closet into the waiting, golden dark.